made with spoken. The Peleg Manuscripts by Gabriel Stroop. Digital narration performed by Alistair Finch. Preface. This trilogy is my love poem to language, not just as structure and sound, but as memory, invention, and survival. The Peleg Manuscripts draws from the vast, branching river of human expression, where each tongue is both a tool and a worldview, shaped by terrain, time, and necessity. I had once heard humans being called the chattering apes, and I find no shame in that. We speak to persuade, to play, to mourn, to belong. We coin new slang as quickly as we forget old proverbs. We sing lullabies in vanishing dialects, even as we debate policy in global lingua francas. Language has always been more than communication. It is how we become human to each other. What fascinates me most is not the rules of language, but its wild diversity, born from our species' resilience, creativity, and stubborn insistence on naming the world. Each language is a lens that reshapes thought. Every lost grammar is a worldview extinguished. Today, unlike most of our ancestors, we are able to listen across centuries. We can read the words of people who never imagined their voices would echo into our time. That miracle, the survival of thought across silence, is made possible by the scholars, translators, and stewards who keep these voices alive. This work stands on their shoulders. May it honor their efforts and inspire new ones. Book 1. The Descent of Peleg. Prologue. The Whisperer's Grove. Con negit. Hijos verit. Gum dingit. A dog runs. A horse carries. A human dies. A voice stirred the void. The first breath. The oldest whisper. Neither light nor shadow. Only word. From that utterance, the first tree rose, not of leaf and bough, but of thought and tongue. Its roots drank deep from the wells of knowing. Its branches stretched into the silence, bearing words unspoken. For a time, all was one. Then came the wind. The limbs shuddered, the leaves murmured, and the oneness cracked, not in breaking, but in becoming. Cord we deity, asked one branch. What do you see? Read May. I see, answered another. But they no longer saw the same. The roots still touched, yet the voices bent away, each carrying its own breath. Southward, one branch unfurled in marble halls. Hellenica, voice of the seekers. Another traced stone and road. Latina, tongue of order. In the mist, a shadowed song. Celtica, whisperer of unseen things. To the north words clung like frost. Germania, keeper of firelit names. To the east, a river of voices wove through valley and steppe. Slavia, shifting as the waters. And in the south, dawn's hymn rose. Indo-Arya, keeper of time's first prayers. The whisperer passed unseen, its breath spent, its presence scattered. Are you still here? One voice called. The wind answered only in echoes, a rustling of many tongues. The first voice was gone. Or perhaps it lingered, quiet in the roots, waiting for those who might listen. And the forest grew, stretching ever outward, carried by the winds of time. Act 1. The Argent Spire. Observation 1. The Spoken Divide. I have spent the evening in debate, though I wonder now if I can still call it such. A debate implies an exchange, a contest of ideas, where both parties stand to gain some measure of understanding. What transpired tonight was nothing of the sort. It began in the Hall of Orators, where my fellow Latin and Greek scholars hold their discourse. I was among them, as I have always been, seated at the long marble table, where the brightest minds of the spire convene. The lamps burned low, casting flickering shadows on the frescoes of Homer and Virgil. It was there that I spoke of language's flow, its evolution, its tendency not toward perfection but toward transformation, shaped by the voices of the people rather than the pens of scholars. And it was there that they dismissed me. Again, they laughed. not in malice but in the manner of men who believe themselves secure atop the mountain, the summit, looking down upon those who stumble in the levels below. Languages do not change, one of them said, swirling a goblet of wine between his fingers. Not truly, they only decay. Another, a Greek rhetorician of high esteem, spoke as if lecturing a student rather than engaging a peer. The vernacular is a corruption of the ideal. The tongues of the common folk are but broken fragments of the great languages. It is our duty to preserve purity, not to concern ourselves with the mutterings of the unlearned. Purity always comes down to purity. They speak as if language were carved in stone, something to be quarried, shaped, and set for eternity, but I have listened to the traders who come bearing goods from the lower levels of the tower. Their speech a tangle of tongues, mixed with some rougher, unknown dialects. Their words are not decay. They are growth. I argued this. I always told them of the patterns I had noticed, the bridges between the tongues, the way even our own Latin and Greek had once been something else, before we polished them into what we now call classical. I told them that to fix a language in place was to strip it of its life, to turn it into a relic rather than a tool for thought. And yet, my words were met with the weight of tradition, the unshaken certainty of men who refuse to listen. You see connections where there are none, they told me. You place too much faith in change, they told me. You waste your intellect on trivialities, they told me. Maybe they are right. Or perhaps they have spent too long within these marble halls, breathing the same air, speaking the same words, circling the same thoughts like birds trapped beneath a domed ceiling. Like rats stuck in small cages. I left before the discussion ended, though I doubt they noticed my absence. I walked the high corridors, past the great statues of the forefathers, Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, past the sealed libraries, where the oldest texts rest in dust and reverence. I walked until I came to the eastern balcony, where the tower looks out upon itself, the stairs spiraling downward into mist. It was there, standing on that balcony, that I made my decision. I will descend. If I am wrong, then let me see it with my own eyes. Let me go to the lower halls, where the vernacular tongues thrive, where the words change not by decree, but by need. Let me find the people who speak not to preserve, but to communicate. I will return when I have the truth, not as they define it, but as I discover it. Perhaps the spire is not as solid as it appears. Peleg. Observation 2. The marketplace of whispers. I descended down the spiral, through the vaulted archways of the lower tier of the spire. The air trembled with the clamour of 1,000 tongues, each voice a thread in the great tapestry of the market. Here, amid the labyrinth of traders and travellers, language knew no master. It wove itself through bartering cries and whispered dealings, shifting as fluidly as the rivers that carved the tiers below. Here, words held no dominion over men, but men over words. The scent of ripe fruit and spiced wine clung to the warm air as I passed through the throng of heads and hands. There, amid heaps of fragrant wares, a merchant laid out baskets of pomegranates. Their crimson skins caught the dim light like scattered embers. I reached for one but hesitated in the gesture. "Quanti?" I asked, shaping the word as it was taught to me in the high halls of the summit. The merchant, his face lined with the wisdom of countless exchanges, tilted his head, the flicker of a knowing smile touching his lips. "Quanto?" he returned, the final vowel stretched into something unfamiliar, something unbound. A ripple passed through me. A single breath, a mere shift in sound, and I was marked, exposed. In that instant, I was no scholar, no seeker of knowledge, but a foreigner in the land of the living tongue. "Quanti," I repeated, as though correcting an errant student. "Quanto," he answered, not as correction, but as honest truth. There, in the space between two syllables, I saw it, the arrogance of the summit, the folly of believing language to be bound in ink rather than in breath. What my brethren would call a corruption, I now recognized as life itself. The speech of these people was not some lesser form of the grand tongue, not a delusion of some imagined purity. No, it was the movement of nature, shaping and being shaped in kind. As I wandered through, I let the words of the market fill my ears, tasting their syllables as I tasted the fruit in my hands. I heard Latin and Greek, but no longer as the polished relics of my studies. These tongues bent and twisted, their edges softened by the wear of countless mouths, worn smooth by time and necessity. Yet, beneath their transformations, echoes stirred. Sounds I had only glimpsed in the faded scripts of forgotten parchments. Ghosts of language speaking forward through the ages. The masters of the summit call this decay. They clutch their scrolls and scoff at the vulgarity of the streets. But who then is truly bound by ruin? Those who move and change, or those who turn to stone, crumbling beneath the weight of their own stagnation? As I turned to descend once more, the clatter of voices trailing behind me like a fading hymn, I met the gaze of Aurelius, a fellow summit scholar, a man who had long dismissed my inquiries as folly. His robes were untouched by the dust of the market, his posture as rigid as the letters he revered. "Have you taken the scholar's interest in the commoners' lives, Peleg?" he mused, his classical Latin pristine as ever. "Only in the words they give it," I replied, the weight of the market still upon my tongue. He scoffed, a sound as hollow as the halls above. "Why dirty yourself with the noise of the lower tiers? Let them have their vulgarity. The true tongue lies in the texts, not in the mouths of merchants." And there, in that moment, I saw the walls of the summit not as pillars of wisdom, but as the stones of a tomb. "The streets shape the tongue far more than the texts ever will," I said. Aurelius laughed, though there was no mirth in it. "You always were a dreamer. A dreamer. So be it. If to question is to dream, then let me never wake. For knowledge is not hoarded in the heights of the tower, nor pressed into the rigid forms of ink and parchment. It moves, it breathes, it lives in the tongues of those who are never heeded, whose voices rise and fall like the tide against stone. And so, let my brethren cast their scorn like stones upon the path. Let them mock. Let them turn away. I will not. I would sooner walk hungry into the depths of the tower than sit fat and blind in its heights." Peleg. Act 2. The Middle Levels. Observation 3. City of Grand Tongues. I beheld it from the heights, a city sprawling like a living manuscript, its avenues inked in the tongues of imperial airs. The arches that framed its streets still bore whispers of Rome's architects, yet the voices that passed beneath them had long since slipped from their ancestors' grasp. The air trembled with the sound of Latin reborn, its rigid forms reshaped by time's chisel, its cadence bent by the weight of history. Here, language was no tomb of scholars, no relic of a lost perfection. It was a river, carving, eroding, reshaping. The merchants greeted me, not as an outsider, but as a fellow traveller, eager to share their wares and their words alike. They carried themselves with the pride of men who knew they stood at a crossroads, their speech neither wholly their own nor entirely another's. Each bore the imprint of the empire that birthed them, yet none spoke in the voice of Rome. The Italian was the first to welcome me. His tongue, the closest to the Latin of my own, rolled with a looseness unknown to the summit. He spoke as one whose words moved with the gestures of his hands, whose speech was meant to be felt as much as heard.
"You scholars chase perfection,"
he told me, his voice lilting like song.
"But we have given Latin life."
He was not ashamed. His tongue was not a ruin to be mourned, but a vessel still moving forward, carrying Rome's legacy in new and unexpected shapes. Then came the Spanish merchant, his speech weightier, hardened by sun and conquest. He dealt in silks and spices from beyond the known lands. His words bore the imprint of every traveller and warrior who had passed through his country's gates.
"We take what is given to us,"
he said,
"and make it our own."
His tongue was a landscape, its consonants shaped like the edges of mountains, sharp as swordplay yet softened in the lull of poetry and crashing waves. a tongue of emperors and exiles alike. The Lusitanian stood apart, his voice quieter, slipping between vowels like the murmuring tide. He listened as much as he spoke, and when he answered me, he did so with the ease of one who had heard my tongue in countless others.
"We have many brothers,"
he said.
"Some closer than others, but none too distant to be known."
He spoke of a cousin across the sea, one whose words had tangled with the tongues of the jungle, and taken root in foreign soil. Even the reach of empire had not ended where its banners fell. All three had shared a camaraderie, but even within this I found division. The Frenchman was the first to name it. His Latin was wrapped in the syllables of bards and warriors from the misted forests beyond Rome's grasp.
My words wear different cloaks,
He admitted.
but the heart beneath them remains the same.
Yet even among his own there was debate. Some saw his Latin as stronger for the weight it carried, the voices it had gathered. Others saw it as diluted, distant from the language of emperors. Then there was his Romansh cousin, his tongue unpolished but unmistakable, shaped by the cold defiance of the mountains. He had felt the winds of foreign speech, but unlike his French kin, he had not let them reshape his own. His was a language preserved, not changed, yet one no less at risk of fading beneath the march of time. And last came the Romanian poet, the farthest flung, yet in many ways the closest to what had once been. His speech bore the echoes of Latin untouched by the smoothing hands of the West, while it carried the breath of eastern lands, a mingling of voices along distant rivers.
"You hear in me what the others have lost,"
he told me.
"but I am not a relic. My Latin still lives, even if it has learned to dance with foreign steps."
I walked the city in silence, the weight of these voices pressing upon me. The inscriptions on its monuments bore the careful, chiseled hand of empire. Yet the street signs twisted these same letters into new shapes, carrying new meanings. Traders shifted between dialects as fluidly as they exchanged coin. In taverns, men quarreled over whose Latin was truest, each convinced that his voice alone carried the purest echo of Rome. And I realized I had heard this argument before. In the halls of the summit, the supposed height of the tower, scholars debated endlessly over the sanctity of classical Latin, dismissing all deviations as corruption. And yet here, in the world below, men had built entire civilizations from those deviations. They spoke Latin in 1,000 new voices, each living, each evolving, none willing to call themselves lost. The summit would call them lesser. But as I walked the beating heart of the Empire's children, I saw them for what they truly were. Evolution, not decay. And I wondered then, what else had the tower hidden from me? If even the language of Rome had been reshaped by those below, what else might I find in the depths of the tower? The summit would have me believe that descent is loss. But I now suspect it is something else entirely. The tower calls to me, and I will answer. Peleg. Observation 4. The Shattered Tongues. I wandered from the bustle of cities into the mist-clad forest, where the land itself seemed to breathe with the rhythm of time. The roads here were not forged by the hands of empire, but rather meandered, like the path of an ancient melody, winding through valleys and over ridges, as though the earth itself recalled the song of a forgotten age. The mist was thick, like the smoke of 1,000 unseen fires, shifting with a deliberate grace, hiding the land and then unveiling it again, as if reluctant to allow one to grasp its full breadth. Before I reached the heart of these Celtic lands, I passed through the ruins of the Gauls. The Frenchman had mourned the loss of a language he could not name, that had once reached the heartland of Rome itself. Here, amidst the crumbling stones and broken remnants of their villages, I caught the faintest echo of a tongue that had once roared against Rome's encroaching shadow. Gaulish, a language swallowed by the very empire it once defied, outcompeted by its close Indo-European cousin. It lingered in the air, like the last tremor of a fading storm. A farmer, whose back was bent from years of toil, spoke to me in rough Occitan, his words tinged with the weight of his ancestors' silence. He gestured to the fields before us, his hands sweeping through the air as if he could still summon the speech of those long gone.
They spoke it here once,
he said, his voice thick with the resignation of a world lost.
but we let it slip away. Now it is only a whisper beneath another tongue.
Do you remember any of it? I asked, my words soft, as though I too feared disturbing the very air around us. He shook his head, a sorrowful gesture.
The Romans took our words and shaped them into their own. What is left is not ours anymore.
I stood silent, the weight of his words sinking deep within me. For here, in the vestiges of what had once been a living tongue, I saw not just a language lost, but a people diminished, their voices smothered beneath the heels of empire. Gaulish had not merely been defeated by force of arms. It had been consumed, absorbed into the very fabric of Rome's power. It was no longer a language in the living sense, just a shadow, scattered in fragments of speech, half-remembered and fading. I carried that thought with me as I left the remnants of Gaul behind, crossing into the land where the people still held fast to words that had not yet turned to dust. Here, the language did not move like the rigid structure of Latin. It did not stand as proud and immovable as a monument, nor did it bend and twist in the polished form of empire. Here the words swayed, rippling like the wind across the hills, flowing in harmony with the land itself. I arrived just as the evening fires were kindled, their flames casting long flickering shadows against the darkening hills, and the air hummed with the sound of music. Flutes, strings, and drums wove together like the very threads of speech, their rhythm as much a language as the words themselves. There was no parchment, no stone, no inscriptions to carry the knowledge of this place. The words here lived, passed on from mouth to ear, from breath to breath, in the eternal dance of story and song. A bard stepped forward, his presence commanding stillness. He spoke first in the Irish tongue, his voice rising like a prayer, filled with the power of ancestors whose names had long since faded into the night.
Anocht in simscéal na galte agus na foraye,
he began.
Tonight I tell the tale of the wind and the sea.
The people leaned in, their eyes wide with reverence, their hearts open to the words. They did not listen as mere listeners. They were part of the telling, woven into the fabric of the language itself. The words swirled around me, fluid and untamed, unburdened by the structure that would chain them in the halls of academia. Even though I did not fully understand their meaning, I felt the weight of them. They did not simply recount history. They carried it within them, a history of breath, of life. I noticed, too, the gathering's subtle order. The ones seated closest to the bard wore cloaks trimmed with gold and bronze, warrior lords whose ancestors had ruled by sword but listened now in silence. Behind them sat those whose words were their weapons, the poets, the druids, the memory keepers whose voices held as much power as any blade. And farther back, near the fire's edge, sat the poor, the shepherds, the gatherers, the worn and watchful labourers whose lives had long been shaped by the words of others. But here, all listened together. The divisions remained, yet dissolved for a moment in the shared breath of the tale. Beside me, a younger bard whispered in faint Manx, his voice a mixture of reverence and sorrow.
This is our memory,
he told me.
A tongue unspoken is a life unlived. To let it fade is to sever ourselves from the ones who walked before us.
His words pierced through me, deeper than I cared to admit. I had studied language as one studies ruins, catalogued, labelled, inert. But here, amid smoke and song, I saw what I'd missed. Language not as record, but as ritual. Here, language was no relic pressed into stone. It was a current of breath, coursing through mouths, not monuments. It lived in the silences between verses, in the rising heat of the fire, in the way names were remembered only when spoken. As I stood among them, an elder approached, his gaze piercing, as though he saw through the layers of time that separated us. His hair was silver, and his face was lined with the weight of years lived and words spoken. He spoke softly in Cornish, his voice heavy with experience.
"We have seen what happens to those who forget their words,"
he murmured.
"The Gauls let theirs slip away, and now their children speak the tongue of Rome. We do not write ours down, not because we cannot, but because to write is to surrender. If our words are not carried in breath, they are already dead.
I stood in silence. Here, in the firelit circle, I understood. Language was not a tool of power, it was a vessel of belonging, of defiance, of survival. The Gauls carved their resistance into stone, thinking permanence would preserve them. But stone eventually forgets what breath remembers. These people, here in the forest, had never surrendered. Their tongues lived, because they were spoken. The bards sang long into the night, not for show, not for pride, but for survival. Every note was resistance, every story a pulse. And yet, I knew that songs do not build walls. Songs do not stop the tide of war. Beyond these hills, beyond the smoke of their fires, other peoples stirred, peoples who had never sung the same songs, who had never known the same peace. Their tongues were not shaped by poets, but by warriors, and their words did not ripple like water, but struck like iron. The tower had broken their tongues long ago. The Gauls' words had turned to ink, their breath to silence. But here the fire still burned. Here, language lived, defiant, because it was spoken. Peleg. Observation V. The Warring Tongues. From the misted forests of the Celts, I descended into a realm scarred by migration, war, and shifting allegiances. A land where the earth itself bore witness to centuries of struggle. The air was thick with the voices of the Germanic tribes, West Germanic, North Germanic, East Germanic, each tongue bearing the weight of those who had come before, echoing across the winds that howled through these unsettled lands. I had heard their names whispered in the camps of the Celts, spoken with a blend of respect and guarded wariness. To us at the summit, they were the Germani, a term too broad to capture their essence, their histories, or their words. We called them barbarians, though their languages were anything but crude. I had heard other names, too, Saxons, Goths, Langobards, Vandals, Franks, Normans, each marking a place, a history, a deed, and in each name a tribe, a people, and a struggle. For even among themselves they were not one, but many. I stopped in a clearing, the underbrush stirring with the weight of unseen movement. A whisper, carried on the wind, caught my ear.
A stranger comes, ears open, tongue still.
Came a mutter in Old Norse, low and cautious.
What does he seek?
Another voice, deep and rigid, answered in Old High German.
Perhaps he is a spy, or worse, a Roman, with ink-stained hands and promises like rotted wood.
Their words, though intelligible to one another, struck with different rhythms, each sentence shaped by a distinct memory of conflict. Tension pulsed not just between them and me, but among themselves. Hands hovered near sword hilts and axe handles, but not all eyes were on me. Some watched each other, testing loyalties. I raised my hands in a gesture of peace, careful to show no threat. I am no Roman, I said, my voice calm. Nor do I seek your oaths, all your land. I am a traveller, a keeper of words. I have spoken with your kin, scattered across the lands, from the farthest reaches of my own Latin brethren, who spoke of you with both admiration and wariness. A tense silence followed. Then, from the brush, a figure emerged, furs and iron draped across her shoulders, her eyes sharp as flint. Her voice came measured, in Gothic, her posture straight, but her gaze flickering to the others first, as though checking where they stood.
You know our words beyond the rivers, beyond the seas?
She asked, her tone careful, not impressed, but alert, like a leader walking a fraying line. Further than even your longships have sailed, I replied. Romanche, French, Spanish, Italian, each carries traces of your breath. And with my help, your words will endure further still. Another voice of deep Norwegian scoffed from the shadows.
We do not need a Roman tongue to carry our own.
But the elder woman held up her hand, silencing the protest with a glance. Her eyes returned to me, less hostile now, more curious, but not unguarded. Their suspicion did not vanish. It merely settled, like dust around old wounds. But something had shifted, a glance exchanged, not of unity, but of shared calculation. That night, I sat among them, listening. They spoke of great journeys across frozen seas, of invasions and settlements that had shaped not just their lands, but the very nature of their speech. Their language was not merely a tool. It was a banner, a shield, a heritage passed down through blood and exile.
Our fathers spoke as we do.
One warrior mused, his Icelandic voice deep and reverberating, like the crash of waves upon stone.
But their fathers did not, and our sons will shape these words anew. What you carry forward will not be the same as what we speak.
Despite their fierce independence, I noticed something curious, a reverence, however grudging, for Latin, the language of priests and conquerors, scholars and laws. They borrowed from it freely, reshaping its words to suit their tongues, yet never surrendering fully to its rule. Their language was in motion, absorbing, adapting, yet always resisting the pull of the Roman world. A grizzled man, his brow lined with scars, and his face weathered by years of war, chuckled as he passed me a horn of mead.
"If you do this, scholar, then you are a fool,"
he said in boisterous Danish, with a laugh that rang like stones dropped into the sea.
"But perhaps an honorable fool."
He nodded toward the drink.
"If you can stomach it, we will teach you our words. If not, your journey ends here."
I drank. The bitter warmth of the mead burned down my throat. But I did not falter. The laughter rang out, filling the night air, and with it, the tension loosened its grip. As the fire crackled, the warriors spoke freely, of war and wanderlust, of lost brothers and unbroken oaths. Their voices wove through the dark like the histories they carried, each word a testament to their survival and resilience. But as I listened, I sensed there were gaps in their stories, places they spoke of with distant admiration, others with thinly veiled disdain. One warrior, his gaze fixed upon the flickering embers, muttered of a people beyond the great forests, tribes whose words were unlike theirs, yet carried the same scars of conquest and defiance.
They have their own way of speaking,
he admitted in quiet Dutch.
and they have fought as we have. But they kneel to other masters, priests, emperors, all tongues that seek to swallow theirs whole.
Another elder woman, who had remained silent until then, met my gaze, speaking in her rare Frisian.
"You wish to carry words across the lands?"
she asked. Her voice soft but heavy with meaning.
"Then go east. Hear them for yourself."
I nodded, but something still tugged at me. An older name I had heard only in fragments and half-remembered songs. The Teutons, a people half-forgotten, straddling two worlds. To some, they were Celts swallowed by the northern mists. To others, they were the earliest of the Germani. Their name lived on as myth, as slur, as pride. No one here spoke of them openly. Perhaps they feared what they represented, a time when borders were not yet set in blood, iron and class, when identities flowed as freely as the rivers they crossed.
"There were those before us,"
a younger voice whispered beside me, in hesitant Alemannic.
"They came with bronze and fire. We took what was left and made it our own."
I wondered then how many tongues had been silenced to give rise to the ones I heard now. How many tribes, like the Teutons, had vanished, not into the earth, but into the marrow of the languages they left behind. The fire burned low as the night stretched on, and I did not sleep. As the first light of dawn broke over the camp, I set my course toward the east, where the voices of the Slavic tribes awaited me. Peleg. Observation 6. The Oppressed Tongues. The roads eastward were long and winding, carved by rivers and swallowed by endless forests. The Germanic lands had been wild, untamed, and restless, but the lands I now entered held something else, an unnerving stillness. It was not the peace of the untouched, nor the calm of the wise, but something heavier, a silence, pregnant with centuries of waiting. The Slavic tongues did not roar like the winds of the Norse, nor march with the precision of Latin. They whispered like leaves in the wind, and rumbled like distant thunder, heavy with the weight of history and memory, long buried. I thought of the Romanian poet I had met so long ago, the one who had spoken of tongues caught between empires.
Some words are bridges,
he had told me, his voice thick with sorrow and pride.
but ours are battlegrounds.
At the time, I had only half understood his meaning. But now, as I walked deeper into the Slavic lands, feeling the soil beneath me hum with ancient sorrow, I felt the full weight of his words settle into my bones. The battle had never been fought with weapons alone. No, the battle was fought with words. I came upon a village nestled along a riverbank, its wooden homes standing as sentinels, timeless and quiet. There was no bustle here, only a watchful peace, the kind of stillness that suggests something old, something deep, waiting just below the surface. The people were wary, their eyes shadowed by something darker than suspicion. It was a heaviness, an old memory that had never passed, a past that lingered, a past that shaped the way they spoke, the way they lived. An elder, his beard thick with grey and eyes clouded with years, stepped forward. His voice, when it came, was in Old Church Slavonic, a language older than any empire I had yet encountered.
"You come from the west,"
he said, his words slow and deliberate.
"Do you bring its tongue with you?"
"I bring only my own," I answered, choosing my words carefully, "and the wish to hear yours." A murmur rippled through the gathered villagers, some nodding, others exchanging glances, their voices low. A younger man, his arms crossed over his chest, spoke in Russian, his voice sharp and guarded.
"We have had listeners before, but they did not listen."
Another elder, a woman with silver hair that caught the light of the fading sun, raised her hand, silencing the murmur with her presence. She spoke in Ukrainian, her voice commanding yet gentle.
He is not like them.
She turned to me.
You wish to hear our words? Then listen to the weight they carry.
They told me of the past, of how their voices had been shaped not only by time, but by resistance. Once, their ancestors spoke freely, their tongues bound only to the land and the sky. But the coming of others had changed all that. The Norse, bearing trade and rule, spoke their language, but they spoke with the weight of conquest, as if the very presence of their speech should silence the Slavic ways. Then came the Greeks, wielding the language of God, telling them their prayers were only holy in the tongues of empires. Latin followed, with its own priests and scholars, casting Slavic words aside as crude, unworthy of ink or parchment.
They gave us their words.
A woman murmured in Polish, her voice trembling like a fragile thread about to break.
But they did not give us choice.
And yet,
another voice echoed. A man's in Serbo-Croatian, his words firm with the certainty of generations.
We did not vanish.
I saw it then, not just sorrow, but something fiercer, something that could not be named in the silence between their words. It was defiance, a fire that had smoldered for centuries, quietly burning beneath the surface. Their voices had been called lesser, unworthy, but they had endured. They had made their own letters when others had denied them the written word, carved their prayers in their own tongue when Latin had refused them a place in the sanctified halls. I paused, a thought stirring in the quiet of my mind. What makes a language worthy? I asked, more to myself than to them, my voice no louder than a whisper. A boy, no older than 12, his face innocent yet wise, in a way only such a life could make him, spoke in soft Bulgarian.
That we still speak it.
The answer sat heavy in my chest. I had climbed this tower, believing language to be a path to knowledge, a measure of civilization. But here, among those who had fought to keep their words alive, I realized I had been blind. Language was not just a means of learning. It was survival, a rebellion against those who sought to silence it. I thought of the silence in the village, of how their words had been the only thing left untouched by time and power. It was not the Roman Empire or the rising wave of the Franks that had conquered them. It was the slow, suffocating weight of erasure. Language, once silenced, could take centuries to reclaim. As the night deepened, the fire crackled, and their voices filled the air, winding through the dark, like the histories they carried. Their stories were not of glory, nor of triumph, but of endurance, of surviving empires that sought to blot them out. They spoke of the Ottoman Empire, of invasions that stretched the boundaries of their tongues to breaking points, but even then, they had refused to be swallowed whole. In their words, I heard the echoes of those who had fought with everything they had, not to become invisible.
Do not mistake silence for surrender.
One of the older women said, in a soft, almost lyrical voice of Slovenian, glancing toward the dark forest beyond their village.
We have lost battles, but we have not lost our right to speak.
That night, as the fire crackled and voices filled the air, I understood no language is superior. Only those who claim dominion over others dare to say so. But even as I sat among them, a dispute stirred within the group. Some spoke of writing down their histories, carving their words into permanence. Others scoffed, what use were letters if the world refused to read them? And some, weary with the weight of old battles, murmured that survival did not come from stubbornness but from knowing when to yield, when to adapt. Their debate drifted into the night, unresolved, and I realized something uneasy within myself. I had come to listen, but what did I truly carry with me? I had heard the tongues of conquest, and now the tongues of resistance. But was that enough? Could I really claim to understand, or was I merely another traveler, collecting words without knowing their full cost? I left before dawn, not with certainty, but with more questions. If I returned to this place one day, would I still find their voices, or would the silence of time claim them at last? I had further to go, and I was no longer sure I would find the answers I sought. Peleg. Observation 7. The ever-winding stair. The road eastward unravelled like an ancient thread, winding through valleys where time seemed to pool rather than flow. I had heard the voices of conquest and resistance, tongues that shouted, defied, endured in battle. But now I sought something else, not languages that fought, but those that remained, those that weathered history not through fire, but through stillness. In the mountains, I met the Albanians, sharp of voice and eye, their speech as honed as the ridges that carved their land. Their words bore the lean musculature of endurance, shaped by hardship and silence. One man, his face cut with age and wind, stared into the flames beside me, and spoke with the hard certainty of stone.
They came with swords and laws,
he said.
With flags, alphabets, and tongues that claimed dominion. They built their cities and gave them new names. But we were here before they named us, and we are still here.
His voice was neither bitter nor proud. It was cold fact. Their language bore the marks of foreign tongues, Ottoman, Roman, Slavic, but its spine was unbroken. It had bent, yes, but it had not knelt. Further east, amid the folded hills of Armenia, I found a language carved in memory. They spoke softly here, as though each syllable were a prayer passed down. Their alphabet, wholly their own, curled in the air like smoke from incense. An elder traced its shape with a shaking finger.
Our words are carved in stone,
he said,
but carried in exile. When they took our land, they did not take our speech. We walked across deserts and oceans with our language folded into the lining of our hearts.
They did not speak of defiance. They sang of survival. I listened to their hymns, ancient verses woven into song, and in them I heard more than meaning. I heard continuity. Not conquest, not resistance, but something older. Faith, memory, and the unwillingness to forget. Northward still, into the Lithuanian forests, the language changed again. Here, the air was clean, full of loam and bird call. A young woman,
her hands earthy from digging roots, grinned when I asked about her tongue.
They say our speech is old.
She laughed.
They say it like it's a relic. It's not old, it's alive. The others changed. We remembered.
She spoke quickly, with a rhythm that felt both playful and sacred. Her words danced with Indo-European echoes, roots long vanished from other tongues. Here, those roots breathed. This was not a language of conquest, nor even of grief. It was a celebration of what had been kept whole. Each of these tongues had faced erasure, yet none had vanished, not through revolution or rule, but through persistence. They survived, simply, by being spoken, by existing when no one expected them to. I was born among scholars who spoke Greek, a language once crowned as the vessel of reason and philosophy, the language of forms and definitions, of rigorous logic and universal claims. In the academies where I had once studied, tongues like Albanian or Armenian were called exotic, fragments, mere curiosities, worthy of footnotes, not of reverence. But here, in the depths of the tower, it was Greek that was absent, not erased, simply never endangered. It had never been whispered in secret, never smuggled through fire, genocide, or famine. Greek had survived by lame fortune, not fight. And for the first time, I saw that fortune clearly. What I had once called heritage, my language's triumphs, its clarity, its influence, was, in part, just the absence of loss. There was only the luxury of never having to remember what others tried to take. I thought of my colleagues, back in the polished halls of linguistic hierarchy. I remembered how they ranked languages by their syntactic elegance, their philosophical potential, as if survival were not its own argument for worth. I had set out to trace the long arc of language. But perhaps I was not tracing a path at all. Perhaps I was only now arriving at its beginning. The stairway stretched ever downward, and I would follow. Peleg. Observation 8. The Babelous Bazaar. The stairway led me into a world of flowing voices, where language did not march like Latin, nor stand frozen like the inscriptions of my own past. Here, words moved like water, shifting, adapting, reaching not toward an end, but toward endless possibility. The air was thick with the sense of spices and fresh bread, and the chatter of merchants spilled out from every corner, mingling like a river of sound. I found myself in a bazaar, not unlike the marketplaces I had wandered through in the tower's romance level, where every stall was an echo of commerce, each exchange a moment of transaction both material and linguistic. A man, his stall piled high with colorful cloths, greeted me in Farsi, his voice deep and fluid.
"You've come a long way,"
he said, his eyes twinkling with the familiarity of travelers.
"What is it you seek?"
"To understand the path of language," I replied. "To learn where words come from, and where they lead." He nodded thoughtfully, a smile touching his lips, not one of pride, but something gentler.
"Then listen closely,"
he said.
"Listen not just to the words, but to what they carry with them."
Farsi, a language with roots deep in time, echoed through the centuries, shaped by poets and mystics, alive with the pulse of trade and human exchange. It had lived through empire and revolution, wearing its changes like a garment well fitted to its seasons. Beneath the surface, though, I sensed the undercurrent of survival. For language, like life, is never static. It must bend, must fold, must flow, with the world around it. Around me, the bazaar pulsed with life, and from the heart of it came the sounds of Sanskrit, sharp and dignified. A scholar stood at a stool selling scrolls of ancient texts, his voice carrying across the crowd as he recited verses.
"Though you're not from these lands, I can see you too have the drive of a scholar,"
he observed, his tone steady and measured, his words like stones stacked with care. I only smiled in response, humbled by the recognition of a stranger, far removed from my life at the summit. He smiled in kind, not with arrogance, but with the quiet wisdom of one who has long known the power of words. He motioned me to drink in the sights and sounds of a market that deals in language as much as in goods. And so I listened. Once the tongue of gods and scholars, Sanskrit still stood tall in the shadow of its descendants. Its grammar was meticulous, its structure whole, and in the corners of the Bazaar, it was revered as the language of an age long past. It had been preserved not merely through reverence, but through power, sanctified in temples, echoed in rites. Its elegance was unquestionable, but not untouched. The tension of a language once guarded by caste and ritual now echoed in a world that had changed beyond its reach. Voices swirled around me, each shaped by Sanskrit, but unchained from its symmetry. A woman in a brightly patterned shawl, her basket filled with fruits, spoke Bengali with a wistful laugh as she gestured toward the grand mosque in the distance.
They say Sanskrit is eternal,
She mused.
but eternity does not mean unchanged. It survives because we changed it.
Nearby, a Hindi poet, his hands moving gracefully as he spoke, smiled softly, his words light as breeze and smoke.
Some try to keep language pure,
He said.
But does a river remain a river if it refuses to flow? Or does it become a dam?
I had heard such arguments before, among my own scholars, who revered Greek as the pinnacle of thought, who measured all deviation as decline. Greek, they said, had no need to evolve, as though perfection precluded change. And here, Sanskrit had once been the same, a monument of intellect, canonized by tradition. But its children had not obeyed. They had grown wild, spilling into every street and field, mixing, fracturing, reassembling, singing. Not one remained untouched. A merchant bartered in Urdu, haggling with a customer over the price of embroidered shawls. A teacher recited in Marathi, his words filling the space between stalls. A child chanted in Bhojpuri while tugging at her mother's shawl. They carried fragments of gods in their syllables, yes, but also their own lives, their own griefs and hungers. Not just a lineage, a living inheritance. And still, the thought unsettled me. I remembered a symposium, early in my time at the summit. A young linguist, bright-eyed and unguarded, had suggested that the Greek of the commoners was not a degradation but an evolution. The others had laughed, gently, and I, who should have known better, had said nothing. I told myself that silence was diplomacy. Now, I suspect it was only cowardice. What if Greek, my own scholarly tongue, was not the final form of knowledge, but only a single step in an ever-winding spiral of diversity? What if, by preserving it, we had entombed it? The languages I heard now were not surviving despite change, they were surviving because of it. Greek had never had to fight for its life. It had never been hidden in kitchens or bazaars. It had never carried loss inside every syllable. For the first time, I wondered, had I come here to climb downward toward truth, or had I been dragging the chains of my own language all along? The tower dipped downward, and I followed. Peleg. Act 3. The Foundation. Observation 9. Fossils of the Forgotten Tongues. The stairway led me into darkness. Not the hollow quiet I had known in the tower's upper halls, but a darkness thick with memory. The air was dry and sour, heavy with dust, as if words themselves had been sealed away, too fragile to survive the light. Dim lanterns flickered weakly along the walls, their glow swallowed by the abyss beyond. They revealed towering stone shelves, vanishing upward and downward into shadow. Every surface was crammed with fragments of something once spoken, once written, now barely remembered. I stepped forward. My fingers brushed a clay tablet. Its cuneiform grooves were deep and deliberate, still sharp after centuries of stillness. Hittite. Mycenaean. The voices of kings and scribes who had once ruled the world when it was barely aware of itself. I traced the symbols slowly, not as language, but as relics. Icons, depressions of extinct thought. Further in, I passed more walls of author fossils. Some I could name, most I could not. brittle scratches of Linear B, waving lines of Tocharian, slashing strokes of the Etruscans and Phoenicians who have spoken their tongues long before my classical brethren had arisen to take their place. All bore the weight of voices that had once commanded, pleaded, sung. Now they lived only in the reconstructions of scholars, linguistic taxidermy, preserved shapes without breath. I had seen so many tongues still alive, changing, growing, but here, there was no movement, no sound, no pulse. This was not merely a hall of records. It was a graveyard, a morgue of languages that were neglected by the very scholars that owe their own tongues to them. A gust of stale air stirred the dust, whispering across dead alphabets. I exhaled. How many tongues have been buried?
A question only the river can answer.
I turned. An old scribe stood among the ruins of language. His robes were tattered, his hands ink-stained to the wrist. The lamplight cast long shadows across his face, making him seem half-formed, like someone memory had failed to finish. He smiled, but there was no joy in it. "Who are you?" I asked.
A keeper of voices,
he said.
But even I cannot keep them all.
He gestured to a stone table at the hall's center. Upon it lay a slab, etched with symbols I had never seen. Not cuneiform, not hieroglyphs, not anything that lived in human memory. The carvings were older, blunter, heavier. Not words, but impressions. Pressure, a primal syntax that defied categorization. I stepped closer, hesitating before touching the surface. The ridges were oddly warm. The patterns didn't form any structure I knew. They felt like raw thought set in stone, instinct fossilized before it had ever found a grammar. "What is this?" I whispered. The scribe's smile faded.
Something forgotten before forgetting was possible.
A chill traced my spine. I had spent my descent tracing the roots of language, believing I could follow them to a beginning. But this was something beneath the root. Something the tower itself could not name. "How many languages have been lost?" I asked, though I already knew the answer would fail me. He sighed.
How many rivers have dried? How many stars have burned out?
He shook his head.
You ask the wrong question, traveler. The past is filled with voices that have faded. The real question is, will yours?
I said nothing. I had always assumed my language was permanent, that the words I spoke, the thoughts they carried, would endure. But so too had the Hittites, and the Mycenaeans, the predecessors of my own Greek tongues. Their languages had shaped law, preserved wisdom, built empires. And now, they lived only as puzzles in forgotten corners, deciphered by those who had never heard them sung. One day, would my own tongue be just another artifact in this vault? Studied, but never truly heard. I turned back to the ancient slab. The nameless script seemed to watch me. If language was a river, then this tower had been built on its dried-out bedrock. And if even this place could not name the first voice, what hope did mine have of being remembered? The scribe was gone. No sound marked his passing. Just the hiss of dust falling from an upper shelf, like the last breath of something buried too deep to dig up. I stood alone. Beneath me, shelves groaned under the weight of the unspoken. Above me, the dark continued. There was nowhere left to go but forward. I carefully tread the trail in front of me. Behind me, the slab whispered nothing. Peleg. Observation 10. The floor of silence. The stairway ended. For the first time in my descent, there were no voices waiting to greet me. No tongues flowing like rivers. No echoes of conquest. No prayers of the conquered. Only silence, vast, unyielding, stretching through the chamber like an ocean without shores. The walls, once covered in the inked precision of scribes and scholars, now stood bare. No letters, no glyphs, not even the memory of inscription. The stones beneath my feet were older than memory, smoothed by something more ancient than footsteps. It was as if language itself had never passed this way. And yet, I was not alone. A man sat on a weathered stone, watching me with an unreadable calm. His posture held the weight of long waiting, not for me perhaps, but for anyone who might come. He was neither welcoming nor hostile. He simply was. We sat in silence, not the expectant pause between words, but the deeper kind, the silence before sound, or after its extinction. When he finally spoke, it was in a language that stirred nothing in me. No echo of Greek's precision, nor Latin's order, no cadence I could place. It was raw, shaped by no empire, tied to no lineage. I furrowed my brow. I don't recognize your language. He smiled.
No, you wouldn't.
What is it?
Basque,
he said.
Euskera, to my people.
I searched my thoughts for its root, the branches it must spring from. Surely there was a thread I could follow. But I found nothing. No Indo-European kinship. No trace of linguistic ancestry. It stood apart, unmoored, as if it had not descended from the tree, but grown in a shadow the tree never touched. That's not possible, I murmured. Every language comes from somewhere. The man tilted his head.
Does it?
He gestured to the stillness around us.
You followed the great Tower of Tongues, tracing it down through empire and time. But tell me, what came before the tower?
I opened my mouth. No answer came. My world had been built on lineage. Languages were born, they diverged. They spread like rivers, or fractured like ice. But this place, this man, this tongue, it was something else. Not a branch, not a root, not even a fossil. How can a language exist without ties to another? I asked.
Because not all voices leave marks for your scholars to measure,
he said.
Not all stories are carved in stone. Some survive not because they were carried forward, but because they refused to fade.
His words settled like dust over a monument already forgotten. I had spent my life tracing the Indo-European branches, believing them to form the bedrock of all speech. But this was a crack in the stone beneath that bedrock, a flaw in the foundation. And if one voice had endured outside the grand order, how many others had been lost? How many languages had flickered and died, unrecorded, unnamed, no less real for their disappearance? I looked around the chamber. The silence was no longer empty. It was full, with all that had once been spoken and had vanished without echo. How much have we forgotten? I asked. The man laughed softly.
Enough to make your tower feel small.
A tremor moved through me. For the first time the tower seemed fragile. No longer a monument to memory, but a hollow scaffold, a shell. Is this the bottom? I asked. He studied me.
You still believe the tower was built to reach the ground?
I turned from him, gazing at the unmarked walls, my eyes finding the tower's doors. My descent had never been toward an end. It had only ever been a beginning. Peleg. Observation 11. A door beyond words. The lowest level of the tower had been a tomb of language, filled with whispers of the past. I thought I had reached the end, that there was nowhere further to descend. But then I found the door. It was hidden behind a crumbling wall, its edges worn smooth by time. Unlike the grand entrances of the upper levels, arched gateways carved with the authority of empires, this was no portal of power, just an unassuming slab of stone, half buried in dust, as if it had been forgotten on purpose. I hesitated. Every step I had taken had been downward, deeper into history's grasp, through the layers of language that had shaped the world. Each level had drawn me closer to the bedrock of human thought, uncovering the roots of the past. And yet, this door did not lead further into the tower's depths. It led outward. I placed my hands against the cool stone and pushed. A low groan of shifting weight. Then, blinding light. I staggered back, shielding my eyes. For so long, I had known only the dim lanterns and flickering torches of the tower's interior. The air inside had always felt thick with dust, dry and cold, weighed down by the stillness of centuries. I had never once wondered if there was anything beyond these walls. The tower to me had always seemed endless, a place where language itself had been preserved, contained, and mapped. The truth of its confinement had never occurred to me. But I had been blind. As my vision adjusted, the light revealed something unimaginable, a landscape vast and unbroken, stretching beyond the horizon. The air was thick with unfamiliar sounds, words I could not place, voices unmoored from the great structure I had spent my life descending. In the distance, towering over the landscape like ancient sentinels, stood other structures, other towers. I took a step forward, my breath catching in my throat. They were real. Other towers. Other worlds of language. The sight stunned me. I turned back to the structure I had just left behind. The tower had seemed infinite from within, its halls a monument to human speech, its scholars convinced they had captured all that was worth knowing. From inside, it had always been a pillar, unyielding and certain. But now, from the outside, I saw it for what it truly was, a single stone in a far greater landscape, a fragment of something much more vast and untamed. I let out a slow breath. How many years had I spent here, convinced that the tower was the source of all understanding? The truth, as I now saw it, was that language was not something to be contained, to be mapped or controlled. It was a wilderness, a river, a storm. It was not the creation of scholars who believed they had captured its essence. It was something that flowed, that changed, that spoke in voices far beyond their reach. Should I return? Should I climb back to the top and tell them what I had learned? The thought felt absurd. I imagined their faces, skeptical, dismissive, perhaps even threatened. Would they listen? Could they? Would I find solace in returning to a place that had always felt like home, or would I be trapped in a cycle of denial, forever seeking answers within walls that had only grown smaller with time? The wind swept across the open plain, carrying voices I could not understand, yet somehow recognized. They were calling, waiting. It was not just the wind that spoke now, but the language of the world itself, a language beyond the tower's walls, beyond its structures. I had spent my life descending in search of truth, but truth was not a thing to be found in the dusty corridors of the tower. It was something that moved, that breathed, that had no fixed place. Now, I would step forward. I placed my foot on the threshold, feeling the weight of my decision. There was no turning back. The world outside was vast and unknown, and it called to me with a promise of discovery, of understanding that could never be confined. I had spent so long within the tower's walls, but the journey was not over. It had only just begun. Peleg. Book 1. Epilogue. The Tower of Many Paths. I set down my pen. The ink still pools upon the page, as if the words themselves hesitate at the threshold of an ending, unsure whether they should cross or remain suspended in uncertainty, like the truths they bear. I have recorded all that I have seen, all that I have heard. The voices that echo through the tower's depths, the tongues that once faltered but never perished, the tongues that have perished at its base, the truths that unraveled everything I once held certain. And yet, as the final word rests, a question lingers, a spectre at the edge of thought. Will they believe me? Once, I thought the summit to be the culmination of all wisdom, its foundation anchored in a single, eternal language, the tongue of the learned, the unchanging speech of scholars and scribes. But now, my eyes have been opened to what was always hidden in plain sight. The tower itself is not singular. It is not absolute. It is not even whole. It is a crossroads, a meeting place of the infinite. The languages I have encountered are not held beneath the weight of a single, overarching force. They do not wait in line to serve some final truth. They branch, they widen, they grow. No single path leads to understanding. No one voice claims dominion over all the rest. The tower's walls did not contain language. They only concealed the vast, uncharted terrain beyond. And now, the summit still looms above me, veiled in its certainty, its scholars locked within the limits of their own understanding. They will reject me, dismiss me, Perhaps they will even cast me away as a madman, a fool chasing mirages. I know them too well. They are blind, convinced their truth is the only truth. They will not see what I have seen. But I must return. I must try. I have been to the edge of understanding, only to realize the edge is farther than I ever imagined. The tower is only one in a much larger story. And what I've discovered, what I know to be true, cannot be contained within its stone walls. The true name of the tower is not what they think. They will never accept it unless I force their hands. Before I close this journal for the time, I must give the tower its true name. The Tower of Many Paths. I stare at the words for a moment, watching the ink dry, the finality of it. The descent has ended. But the climb, the struggle, it is just beginning. I will return to the summit. And this time, I will not be ignored. Because there is something they do not know. Something I must reveal. Something beyond the tower itself. And I will not rest until the world knows. The ink dries, the words remain. And now, I must descend once more. Peleg. Book 2, The Ascent of Peleg. Prologue, Ascent of the Unseen. I pick up my pen once more, the ink still fresh upon the page. Its shape suspended in midair, as if waiting for the weight of truth to push it forward. The words I write now carry the same uncertainty as the truths I have uncovered. I once thought my journey down the tower was the end, the final reckoning with all I had come to know. But now I see that it was only the beginning. I have walked its depths, witnessed the forgotten and the lost, the silences that stretch like gaping wounds across time. The tower is not simply a monument to knowledge. It is a prison, a cage built from the very words that were meant to liberate. The voices I once believed to be the guardians of wisdom are now no more than echoes of the past, shouting their truths from within the walls they have so carefully constructed. I thought in my descent that I had learned the final lesson, that the tower was not the ultimate answer to all things, that its walls were not sanctified with absolute truths. But now, as I prepare to ascend once more, I see the full scope of what I had only glimpsed before. The tower is not simply a place, it is a force that has shaped everything around it. And in my time among its depths, I have realized that the very foundation upon which the tower stands is flawed. It is not built upon understanding, nor upon freedom. It is built upon control, the control of ideas. I thought I had come to the edge of understanding, but now the edge seems further away than ever. The scholars at the summit, my have-been colleagues, so certain of their own wisdom, have blindfolded themselves to the truth. They have locked themselves in a tower of their own making. They will never listen to what I have learned. They will never see the truth that now stretches before me, vast and uncharted. Yet I must return. I must try to show them what they refuse to see. But I know this will not be an easy ascent. The tower has changed. The people have changed. And the powers will fight to protect their dominion over knowledge. They will resist. They will reject me, cast me aside as a fool, a heretic. But I will not be deterred. For what I carry within me is more powerful than their walls. What I carry is the knowledge they have long suppressed. Before I move forward, I must share what is to come. I must let the tower know. This journey is not for me. It is for all that lies beyond it. I write these words knowing they may never be read by those who need them most. But still, I must write them. I stare at the ink, the weight of it settling upon the page, and know that the path I walk now will lead to far greater revelations than the one I left behind. The climb will be long, the resistance will be fierce, but I will not rest until the truth is made known. The ascent begins now. Peleg. Act 1, Return to the Tower. Ascent 1, The Gate of the Forgotten. I have crossed the first threshold. The descent, though behind me, still echoes in the silence I now face. This place, this chamber of the dead tongues, once throbbed with the ache of longing, with the weight of voices desperate to be remembered. Now, it lies still, preserved, hollow. This level is dimly lit, the air stale with the scent of sterilized reverence. Rows of fossilized glyphs that I found etched into stone are now sealed behind glass like sacred bones. I remember this place teeming with struggle, with scholars attempting to breathe life into lost syllables, to coax shape from dust. Now, they work not as seekers, but as mere caretakers. They speak in hushed tones, not to disturb the relics, or perhaps not to disturb themselves. I watched as a tour group passed. A line of initiates, eyes wide with awe, though none truly understood what they beheld. Their guide recited dates and phonetic patterns, as if reading scripture, his voice level, practiced. Not a single soul asked a question. Not one dared. In the center of the hall spins a cracked phonograph, looping a single voice, crackly, halting, and unfamiliar, reciting a phrase whose meaning no one remembers. No one dares to stop the machine. I asked what it said. They could not answer. I asked if they tried to translate it. They only blinked. Once, we studied the extinct tongues to revive their breath, to reawaken memory and meaning. Now, the scholars preserve them in amber. The dead languages have become totems, valued only as tokens of prestige. The past is no longer pursued. It is worshipped. And in worship, they have entombed it in place. I tried to speak with one of the curators, an old acquaintance whose passion once kindled my own. She flinched when I mentioned the living spark within even the most decayed phrase.
We do not interpret here,
she whispered.
We exhibit. There is honor in preservation.
Honor, perhaps, but no revelation. They fear the past will change them if they approach it too closely. So they distance themselves behind velvet ropes and spear-proof shields. In doing so, they have silenced what was once on the verge of resurrection. They have become stewards of the dead, not champions of truth. As I left the chamber, I pressed my hand against one of the display cases. Beneath the glass was the inscription I had once deciphered years ago, back when the tower still had questions. Now, even the answer I gave lies unread. This is not the tower I descended through. This is a mausoleum, and its priests have forgotten the names of the gods they serve. And still, I climb. Peleg. Ascent II, the cult of the rootless. The staired path wound upward into shadow, and with each step I felt the air tighten, denser, drier, as though language itself had been bleached from the stone. Here, in the forgotten level of the root tongues, I expected ruin. Instead, I found ritual. The walls were veined with carvings, groping roots etched into the rock, twisting and tangled. Some trailed into nothingness, others cleanly severed. They reached downward as if in search of something lost and unrecoverable. They never reached the soil. This was once a place of radical inquiry. I remember the scholars here, fierce and wide-eyed, seeking to trace language to its deepest strata, beyond Indo-European, beyond record, beyond certainty. They spoke of fragments, of echoes in the dark. Now, they speak no names. Instead, they sing. Low hymns resound through the corridors, their tones formed from phonemes, resurrected by conjecture. Yet their voices carry no meaning. The chants are sung, but never translated. To do so, I'm told, would defile the sound. The singers wear masks, blank, featureless faces molded from clay. The erasure of identity, they say, is necessary to approach the origin.
The self is distortion.
One whispered to me.
Only in unknowing can we return to what once was pure.
But purity is a false god. It had only spurred my departure from the tower, and now it seems that its insidious tendrils are spreading. Their sacred texts are scrolls of reconstructed grammar, filled with roots never known to be uttered by a living tongue. Their temple is a hollow place of hypotheticals, yet they kneel before it with faithful zeal, and in their fervor they have turned against one another. I have found two factions in silent opposition, each convinced the other had tainted the primordial sound. Both refused, to utter a single word in my presence. Their obsession with the root has torn them from the branch. They speak of unity, but cannot even agree on which vowel is sacred. One of them recognized me, an initiate I once debated, years ago, when the masks had not yet covered their faces. We exchanged no words. His hand rested on the hilt of a stylus, as if daring me to write. I left before their rite began, though the chanting followed me. A guttural rhythm, ancient and raw, devoid of meaning, but intoxicating in its conviction. Yet when sound is divorced from sense, it becomes only noise, beautiful, haunting, and empty. They have not found the root. They have become lost within it. And still, I climb. Peleg. Act 2. The Tensions of Truth. Ascent 3. The Empires of Echoes. The air shifted as I entered the level, perfumed by the dust of centuries, sweetened by saffron, and soured by decay. Golden arches rose above me, inscribed with verses I once revered, but they no longer sang, only echoed. This was once a place of oral fire, where chant met meaning, where poets and prophets bent language into living flame. Now, the flame remains only in the gold that has been melted, recast, and forged into the rings worn only by the high custodians of the script. I found the texts behind glass. Layer upon layer of sacred pages lie stacked, like relics entombed, their ink fossilized by reverence. No one reads them now. They are only looked upon, worshipped, feared. The custodians carry keys not to unlock them, but to be melted into ceremonial rings, and worn proudly on fingers that do not turn the pages. I asked to read one. Silence. Then a nod, not of permission, but pity. The chants began behind me, rising in waves, familiar cadences from childhood, from study, from awe, but they now sounded hollow. The voices were rich, trained, beautiful, and still devoid of presence. They echoed off the marble, looping endlessly, as if the tower itself repeated them, to convince itself of its own authority. The scholars I met wore mirrored pendants, etched with script that could only be read in reverse. I stared into one until the words resolved themselves. They were verses of devotion, but every line twisted back on itself, a prayer that locked rather than liberated. The ability to read has become a privilege of the elite.
Truth,
one of them told me,
is like water. It must be directed, contained. Otherwise, it floods.
He gestured to the sealed texts, the echoing halls.
We have preserved the flood.
But preservation is not progress. These halls speak only in echoes now. No new verses are written. No new understandings are forged. The language, once a vessel of transformation, has become its own tomb. A young woman pressed a note into my palm before I left. A single line written in the mirrored script, readable only when I turned away. We are not allowed to translate. She vanished into the chanting crowd. I left the level with the chorus still ringing in my ears, louder than memory, heavier than truth. There is power here, real power, but it is power turned inward, feeding on its own authority. The chant endures not to uplift, but to drown out all that might disturb its rhythm. This empire has not fallen. It has folded in on itself. And still, I climb. Peleg. Ascent IV. The Tripart Council. 3 bells tolled as I entered. One solemn, one shrill, one slow and mournful. They ring not in harmony, but in defiance of one another, marking not time, but territory. The chamber rises like a tribunal, 3 grand thrones at its far end, each draped in a tattered banner of script. Albanian, Armenian, Lithuanian. Their colours once intertwined, stitched together in hope. Now the seams tear daily, pulled taut by unseen hands. The fabric does not fall, it frays. Beneath the thrones the council debates, not in ideas, but in hierarchy. Each faction claims its tongue is the oldest, the purest, the one closest to the root. Each accuses the others of dilution, of betrayal. They speak through interpreters even when they share comprehension. Their disagreements are not born of misunderstanding, but of need. Without conflict, their power would dissolve. Lead coins are exchanged in silence, as tokens of allegiance, of judgment, of rhetorical victory. They bear different scripts, but weigh the same in the scales that tilt endlessly toward whichever hand presses down with greater force. Here, currency is not minted for trade, but for distortion. I spoke once, only briefly. They listened, until they identified the cadence of my phrasing. Then they decided what I meant before I had finished. "You are not neutral," one of them said. "No voice is," said another. "Only the tower is neutral. We merely defend its balance." But the balance they speak of is a weaponized symmetry, a stalemate of pride. No consensus is sought, only dominance denied. At midday, the three factions performed a ritual debate. Each side presented its interpretation of the same ancient proverb, twisting grammar and tone to claim the phrase as their own. None conceded. Applause followed regardless. A scholar, weary-eyed, whispered to me,
"We once believed unity would come through equal representation. But representation is not understanding. It is only a mirror, and mirrors too can fracture."
I stayed until the evening toll. The bells still rang in thirds, never together, always adjacent. The echoes clashed like waves, and not once did they meet in harmony. I moved upward again, my thoughts frayed by their rhetoric. This was once a place of preservation, and now a parliament of pretense. They have mistaken coexistence for concord, and still I climb. Peleg. Ascent V, the ice of allegiance. The chill set in before I saw its source. Frost laced the stairwell's edge, tracing the stone like veins of something long dead. At first I thought it simple weather, but this level has no seasons. The cold is not natural. It was engineered. Here, the silence spoke louder than any voice. I passed frozen plaques embedded in the walls, old dialects etched lovingly once, now obscured under layers of ice. Some I recognized by structure, others by memory. A few were buried so deep, even their names had become rumor. Icicles formed along the signs like tears unwept, crystal and cruel. At the center of the level stood the surveillance totem, a grotesque effigy of power, shaped like a nesting doll, each larger form splitting open to reveal another, ever smaller, more lifeless than the last. The innermost face was not a face at all, only a flat expanse of polished wood. Reflection, without identity. The scholars here do not speak freely. They merely recite. I listened to a broadcast, one of many, echoing through the bitter halls. A voice, indistinct and genderless, read from a standardized lexicon. The cadence was perfect, the grammar flawless, the meaning dead. Emotion had been leached from every word. I approached a group of linguists encased in thin, official uniforms. Their eyes followed me, unblinking. I greeted them in an old dialect, a friendly tongue, once spoken between allies. They flinched. A scholar stepped forward, his voice flat.
Deviation recorded. Correction recommended.
I asked a question of clarity. He answered not with speech, but by producing a small printed slip from a sleeve-bound machine. It contained the same words I had spoken, revised into the state's chosen dialect. The difference was subtle, but intentional. A shift in emphasis, a change in mood. The soul of the sentence had been exiled. Why? I asked.
To preserve clarity,
he said,
and prevent unrest.
But I saw the truth in his posture. Rigid, not from discipline, but from fear. Every phrase, every vowel, every tonal inflection here is measured. Surveillance drones pass like silent birds above, their glass eyes always open. Even the children speak in code, repeating lessons they do not understand but dare not mispronounce. The nesting doll totem looms above the square, watched by no one and everyone. I stood beneath it and whispered a forgotten Slavic word. Soft, gentle, playful. The air around me tensed. But the frost did not deepen. Not yet. It did not linger. The ascent continues. But I carry the cold with me now, lodged behind the teeth, where unspoken words wait to thaw. And still, I climb. Peleg. Ascent VI, the Academy of Iron Tongues. The door to the next level was not carved of stone, nor wood, nor glass. It was steel, hinged, and groaning like the throat of a beast. It did not open for me, but upon me. Within, the air hummed with a sterile static, like breath held in a vault. Iron filing cabinets rose around me, higher than the eye could follow. Endless bunkers of knowledge, labelled in sharp glyphs, locked with keys no longer forged. The scent of cold ink lingered like blood after a duel. No one spoke at first. Only the click-clack of typewriters echoed through the corridors. The rhythm was mechanical, perfect, until someone paused. In the silence after the pause, I swear I heard a gun being loaded. This was the Germanic level once, but what had become of it? Scholars marched in straight lines, each carrying stylus pens shaped like swords, inked not for recording but for combat. Their debates took place on raised platforms resembling tribunals. Arguments stirred with no passion. Precision was their creed. Victory came not by persuasion, but by crushing deviation. I was invited, no, commanded, to sit and watch a debate. Two linguists stood opposite one another. Each citation, each verb form, was delivered with surgical cruelty. The audience responded not with applause, but stamps of metal seals for approval and confirmation. The one who faltered, who spoke a word one generation removed from standard form, was escorted away. Not punished, but removed. Forgotten. I asked where they took the defeated. A younger scholar, eyes sunken and ink-stained, whispered without moving his lips.
They are sorted. Their speech is disassembled until only roots remain.
I wandered the aisles. Cabinets trembled with the pressure of unspoken thought. I reached for one, curious. The moment my hand touched the handle, a voice barked from overhead.
Unauthorized access. Submit dialect credentials.
I withdrew. Slowly, carefully. They no longer seek to preserve language here. They defend it aggressively, even obsessively. The etymology of every term is treated as a lineage of war. Even the word change is considered dangerous. I asked one scholar if anyone still studied the dialects of the common people, the farmers, the mothers, the builders. He responded by handing me a stylus. Its edge was honed to a point.
Let them speak, he said. But know that imprecision is treason.
I returned the stylus, unspeaking. Before I left, I passed beneath a banner stitched with runes and rules, binding cold revered. It read, "To speak wrongly is to unmake order." I left with silence on my tongue. Not for fear of punishment, but for sorrow. Here, language has become a weapon forged in fear, not curiosity. And in such places, no voice can grow. And still, I climb. Peleg. Ascent VII, the Bard Kings. I stepped onto the level of song, expecting wind-swept hills and the hum of forgotten harps. Instead, I found silence, heavy, cultivated silence, the kind that grows in the shadow of censorship. The lands of the Celtic level once rang with living verse, passed mouth to mouth, like flame. But now, those fires smouldered. The first harp I saw hung on a wall like a trophy, its strings severed, its wood cracked but polished to hide the damage. Lyrics were no longer sung. They were etched into bone tablets and mounted behind glass, as if to say, "This is where music died." At the heart of the level sat the Bard Kings. 3 of them, draped in cloaks woven from once vibrant dialects, now dulled to bureaucratic grey. Crowns adorned their heads, wreaths of feathers plucked from songbirds that had been silenced, their voices stolen for pageantry. The feathers twitched in the still air, as if remembering flight. Their court was held in an amphitheatre, shaped like a broken lyre. There, performers stood upon a dais to recite verses approved by the crown. Each melody began with beauty, but just before the final verse, the performance would end abruptly. Censored, cut. The audience, conditioned to expect incompletion, applauded nonetheless. Not for art, but obedience. I met a bard behind the marble pillars. His hands were calloused from unseen strings, his mouth a vault of unsung histories.
They made poets into stenographers,
he said.
Now we write what they dictate, and they call it tradition.
Why don't you resist? I asked. He laughed, quietly.
You think rebellion is a song? No. Rebellion is the silence we leave in every final stanza.
He led me to a hidden chamber beneath the amphitheatre. There, on rough stone walls, verses were carved, raw, unfinished, unapproved. They were dangerous not for what they said, but for daring to say anything unsanctioned. Each line was a wound. Each word a risk. I added one of my own. Truth begins where verse is cut. As I left, the bard kings rose for a procession. The people bowed. The bards played. But no sound escaped their harps. Only dust. This was not a place of language anymore. It was a mausoleum of melody, ruled by monarchs afraid of songs they could not control. I walked on, mourning not only the silencing of tongues, but the sterilization of soul. And still, I climb. Peleg. Ascent VIII, the marketplace of masks. The descent had once brought me here in wonder. Then the romance level glimmered with 1,000 dialects, each a song, each a street performer's call, each a thread in a tapestry woven by many hands. Now, on the path of return, I found only theatre. The marketplace remained, rows of stalls beneath swaying pennants, the scent of ink and melting wax still hanging in the air. But the song had soured. Where once language danced, it now sold itself by the syllable. Authenticity half price, barked one hawker, holding up a tearaway phrasebook with a smile printed on the cover. Regional charm, accent included, cried another, his voice overlapping with 5 others shouting the same in different idioms. I stood among them, nameless, faceless. That was the rule here. No one showed their true voice. Every stall offered masks, papier-mâché, gaudy, brittle, roughly painted in shades of dialect and idiom. Each mask had a name, a voice, a culture. You could try on fluency like a coat, discarded when it no longer fit the fashion. A child reached for one and asked, "Who will I be today?" No one answered. I wandered deeper, past shelves of curated identities. Tear-out cards labeled poet, revolutionary, romantic, realist. Each came with sample lines to repeat in public. Each meant to generate applause. I found a store with a cracked mirror and a sign, genuine dialogue, limited supply. Inside, an old scholar sat slumped, surrounded by phrasebooks missing every 3rd page. His hands shook as he tried to translate my name, not for performance, but understanding.
You don't belong here,
he said, not unkindly.
You came for truth, but we sell certainty.
And certainty was everywhere. Slogans printed in looping script, shouted in every tongue. Freedom through fluency. Your words, your brand. Speak to belong. Each echo clashed with the next, a harmony of contradiction. They had confused noise for vitality, volume for value. In one alley, I found a discarded mask. Plain, unpainted, unused. I slipped it on. It cracked instantly. It was never meant to last. I left the market with no purchases, no performance. Only a question echoing louder than the slogans. Who speaks when no one listens? The answer was not behind a stall, nor in a phrasebook. It was in the silence that followed the last sale, in the crumbling paper underfoot. I moved on. The summit loomed, and above it, something worse than silence. a truth too brittle to be sold. And still, I climb. Peleg. Act 3. The Summit and the Descent. Ascent IX, the Marble Gate. The summit had not changed. It had only calcified, recalcitrant to transformation. I entered through the marble gate beneath arches I once studied with awe, carved with the axioms of dead philosophers, as if the stone itself demanded obedience. The air was cold with certainty. Even the light filtering through the oculus above felt filtered, whitewashed, ceremonial, sterile. They were waiting. My former colleagues stood arrayed along the colonnade like statues come to life, cloaked in academic garb, faces grave with the burden of stewardship. I knew them. I had debated beside them, translated texts with them, toasted new discoveries under those vaulted ceilings. Now their eyes were as hollow as the busts behind them.
Peleg,
said Magistrate Corvinus, voice polished like rhetoric.
You should not have returned.
His words were not warning, they were verdict. I have returned, I said, because the tower is broken. You read the same lines while the foundations rot. You praise logic, but fear its consequence. Murmurs spread like cracks across the chamber. The younger scholars looked away. The elders stood unmoved.
You descend into blasphemy,
said another, Lyra, once my confidant. Her voice trembled, not with doubt, but restraint.
We warned you not to wander beyond sanctioned thought.
I did not wander, I said. I descended. And in descent, I found what our summit lacks. Life. Change. Meaning.
You mistake instability for insight,
Corvinus replied.
We uphold the roots of language itself. Without us, the tower falls.
Then let it fall, I said, stepping forward. If it cannot bear truth, it does not deserve to stand. Gasps followed. Somewhere behind me, the great bell tolled, not in honor, but alarm. Corvinus gestured, and from behind the columns came robed figures bearing scrolls and seals. The tribunal. I had heard of them only in whispers, those tasked with preserving intellectual purity. Their faces were obscured by veils etched with geometric logic. They did not speak. They did not need to.
You are hereby charged,
said Corvinus,
with perverting sacred texts, undermining foundational truths, and introducing corruption into the summit's legacy.
A shadow passed over the chamber. I did not flinch. I will answer your charges, I said. But know this, truth does not cower behind marble. It walks the path of the broken, the silenced, the forgotten. You've mistaken echoes for wisdom. I have heard the voices beneath. The tribunal turned away. I was to be escorted below, to the place where dissenters vanished. As they led me down the winding stairs, I looked once more at the columns. Once they had lifted my spirit, now they pressed down like a tomb. But I smiled, because I had seen what lay beyond the tower. And they had not. Peleg. The summit, the trial of the heretic. I stood before them then, not as a scholar, but as a spectacle. The amphitheatre was silent, save for the echo of my own breath in that cavernous hall. The seats were scorched, burnt with years of intellectual flame. The blackened benches became reminders of debates that had once filled this space. They were charred, hollowed by their own passions, but they remained, the empty witnesses to the hollow convictions of a lost age. At the center of it all stood a single lectern, untouched, unmarked by the hand that once guided it. It was a thing preserved, but not alive, a token of some forgotten ritual. I had been summoned there to speak, to defend myself against charges that hung in the air like the rancid stench of rot. The scholars had gathered, but not to listen. They were there to judge. The tribunal surrounded me, figures in their finest robes, but their faces were hidden behind masks of steel and gold. The masks glistened in the torchlight, but their eyes were blind. To them, I was no longer a peer, but a heretic. A nuisant shadow in their carefully curated world of truth. Corvinus was the first to speak, his voice reverberating across the hall, clipped and sharp like a knife drawn from its sheath.
Peleg, once a prodigy of this summit, now a corrupter of its ideals. You have betrayed the very principles we upheld. You dared to walk paths uncharted, to question that which has been ordained.
The words fell from his lips as though rehearsed, perfectly measured, carefully crafted for the sole purpose of silencing me. Behind him, the tribunal remained motionless, their eyes locked on me, waiting for my words to falter. I did not flinch. I stood before them, the heretic in their eyes, but I knew that trial was nothing more than a pageantry of power, an execution of a mind too dangerous to be allowed to roam free. This was not about truth. This was about control. Lyra spoke next, her voice trembling, but filled with righteous fury.
You have undermined the tower's very foundations. The languages we have studied are sacred. They are not to be corrupted by your reckless abandon.
You would tear down all that we have worked for.
I watched her, beautiful in her passion, and faltering. I saw in her the same conviction that had once guided me, but now it was a hollow thing, bent, twisted by the very system she had once sought to reform. She was no different from the others. None of them were. A scholar from the back rose, clutching a scroll tightly in his hand.
You claim to have discovered new truths, but you have only embraced chaos. The order we have built is perfect. It is eternal. You have fractured it with your heretical beliefs. You are a danger to us all.
Their voices rose in unison, chanting their condemnation in perfect meter, an unnatural harmony, rehearsed like a play. It was an aria of righteousness, performed with precision, but lacking any soul. And yet, I did not speak. Not yet. I was given my seat, a broken quill laid before it, a symbol of the destruction they sought to impose upon me. But that quill was not the weapon they believed it to be. It was a symbol of their own brokenness, their inability to see beyond their own constructs. They were no longer scholars. They were keepers of a rotting temple, holding the remains of what was once alive, now long deceased. I took my seat. The quill sat before me. Its tip cracked. The ink dried long ago. They waited for my defense. But what defense could I offer when their ears were sealed? What argument could I present when they had already made their judgment? I did not speak of the truth I had uncovered. I did not speak of the voices I had heard in the depths, of the languages that no longer echoed in their hollowed-out, once hallowed halls. It would be a waste to their deaf ears. Instead, I simply said this. The tower has fallen, not because of the truths I speak, but because it has lost the will to listen. You no longer seek knowledge, you seek power. And power is always fragile. There was silence. A long, pregnant pause. Then, the bell tolled, once, twice, 3 times. The sentence had been passed. The tribunal's voices rose again, but this time, I heard something new in them, a tinge of fear, for they knew what I had said was true. Peleg. The fall, the final descent. The descent was not sudden. It was inevitable. As I was cast down, a force I could neither resist nor comprehend, I saw the tower in its final moments. The foundation that had once stood firm, that had been the bedrock of knowledge and truth, cracked like brittle stone, under the weight of its own decay. The scholars, blind in their certainty, did not see it. They did not hear the rumble that shook the very earth beneath their feet. They heard only the echo of their own voices, proud and superficial, resonating against walls that dulled away, no longer strong. The statues had begun to crumble before me, those once sacred figures of grammarians and linguistic gods, their faces etched into the tower's marble, now shattered and broken. The statues, the pillars of this edificial structure, bore witness to the fall of their own legacy. Their tongues had been torn from their mouths, as if some higher power had sought to silence the very words they had once spoken. And in their silence, the language they had cherished had turned to dust. It scattered with the wind. The books, they were the most tragic sight. Once revered, these sacred tomes that had held the knowledge of ages now fell like feathers. One by one, their pages catching fire mid-air. They burned with an unnatural light. as if the very fire of truth had become corrupted, no longer purging, only consuming. The knowledge that had been guarded so jealously, hoarded and withheld from the world below, now met its end in flame. It was a spectacle of destruction, a grand pyre that did not cleanse, but further marred what had once been. I could hear my own voice distorted by the cacophony of collapse. It was an echo, yes, an echo from earlier chapters of this journey, reverberating through the tower like a fading whisper. How many times had I spoken of truth, of clarity? Now, those very words seemed garbled, mangled, as if I had never truly understood their weight. The echo twisted, a ghostly reflection of the naive hope I had once held. Could I have stopped this? Could I have seen this fall from the beginning? But it was too late. The tower, like its scholars, had grown too large to comprehend the rot within. The vertical faces that had once seemed invincible were disintegrating before my eyes. And yet the scholars, clutching their burning books, their once pristine knowledge, stood proud. They did not waver. They did not see the ruin that had spread beneath them. To them, the foundation was still whole, the walls still strong. They continued to uphold the crumbling structure, even as it threatened to collapse entirely. It was then that I saw vindication. The tower had never been about knowledge, but power. The knowledge it had hoarded had never been intended for enlightenment. It had been kept to control, to divide, to elevate the privileged few above the many. And in their blindness, the scholars had become the very thing they had once sought to dismantle. The rulers of an empire of words, an empire built on lies, held together by the threads of their own delusions. I was no longer their peer. I was their witness. And so, I fell. Not as one defeated, but as one awakened. The tower was falling, but it had long since lost the power to take me with it. I could no longer follow its decrees, its broken laws. I had seen too much, and now I was free. But in that freedom I knew one thing. The tower would never truly fall, not until the scholars who had built it came to terms with their own corruption. Until then, they would continue to barely uphold its crumbling structure, blind to the fact that the foundation had already cracked beyond repair beneath their feet. And still, I fell. Peleg. Book 2. Epilogue. The Path Beyond the Tower. The gates of the tower had closed behind me, its walls now a distant memory, yet the weight of its silence pressed against me like a forgotten chant, reverberating through my mind. In my exile, I had expected to feel the sting of loss, but what I found was something far more complex. The summit may have rejected me, but the world beyond had not. It had only awaited my arrival. Beyond the tower, the landscape was vast, stretching further than I had imagined. The air was thick with voices, each one rising like a note in a song I had not yet learned to sing. Wild vines wound around ancient stones, spelling out a script I did not understand, yet somehow felt. It was not the language of the tower, nor its scholars, but something new. Alive. Free. A child approached, holding a seed pod that hummed with a language unknown to me. I reached out, the warmth of it like a heartbeat, and for a moment I understood. Language is not a cage. It is a seed, constantly growing, forever branching in every direction. It is endless, evolving, as much a part of us as the breath we take. I had known only one path, one thread in the great tapestry of human speech. But in this moment, I saw the truth. There were other towers, other languages, other people, stretching across the world. Towers I had never known, representing voices far beyond my own Indo-European. Afro-Asiatic, Uralic, Sino-Tibetan, Austroasiatic, Austronesian, Native American, and Niger-Congo. Each one a universe unto itself, a testament to the boundless diversity of the human spirit. I had thought my journey was finished, but as I looked into the horizon, I realized it had only just begun. The tower had shown me its limits, but the world below my feet, held mysteries that would take me further than I could have imagined. And so, I begin again. not with an end, but with a new life. The story of language is endless. Its evolution, as deep and boundless as humanity itself. Peleg. Book 3. Prologue. The Breathless Scroll. I found the scroll today. The last one, blank, except for a seed pressed into its center, like an offering to a god I no longer serve. Around me, the tower exhales dust with every step I take. These walls once felt eternal. Now they groan like old men clutching secrets for too long. I thought I would weep, but I didn't. I just opened the glass case, let the moth fly free, and sat. This tower has, in truth, always frightened me. Not because it hides truths, but because it believes it is the truth's only keeper. We tried to pin the essence of language here, like butterflies in foam. But words don't survive that way. They find death in the stillness. So I did the only thing that felt honest. I breathed on the parchment. Just once. A breath, warm and fleeting. The ink lifted from the old page. The last vestige of my old self vanished with it. Tomorrow, I leave. Not for towers of lingual hubris. Not for glory or rebellion. For towers of humanity. Just to listen again. Peleg. Act 1. The World Without Walls. Tower 1. The Rocks and the Oasis. Afro-Asiatic. I walked alone through the scorched lands, where even shadows shrank from the sun. My old tower, once so immense, had vanished behind me like a half-remembered myth. I had expected noise beyond its walls, a chorus of discovery. Instead, I found silence, but not the silence of absence. It was the silence of breath, held for too long. The earth here spoke in cracks and dust. The sand shifted beneath my feet like pages in a forgotten manuscript. I felt the language of the land pressing against me, not in letters, not in lines, but in rhythm. The beat of absence, of memory unsaid. And then I heard it. A low chant from deep within a canyon, too patterned to be the wind. It pulsed like a heart beneath the soil. A breath buried, then remembered. I followed. The canyon walls rose like ancient consonants, curved and crumbling. I could almost see them form roots and stems. Triliteral, Semitic, recursive. The wind carried remnants of languages that shared internal bones, yet bore different souls. I found them there, in the shadow of a rock face bleached smooth. They stood barefoot, heads tilted to the sky, their voices braided into a single thread. One voice would begin a phrase, another would finish it with a new twist. It was not mere recitation but recomposition, a constant recycling of sounds and meaning. When I stepped forward, the chant broke like water against stone. The elder who turned toward me had a voice like flint, measured, weathered, quietly burning. His Arabic fell into my ears not as words, but as ritual.
"Do you wish to record?"
he asked, gesturing to the stones around us, worn clean by centuries of wind.
"Once, these bore our names, but the wind has taught us otherwise."
I reached for my pen, an old reflex. He stopped me with a glance.
"To write is to trap, and a trapped word dies."
Another elder, speaking in a lilted Aramaic that sang like cracked bells, added,
"We remember by speaking, and when we forget, we listen until it returns. That is how a language lives."
There were no texts here, no grammars. Only memory passed through lungs and throats. I saw it, how each speaker adapted the chant, reshaped it, root by root, vowel by vowel, until it fit the moment. No two recitations were the same, and yet the meaning endured. They told me in their tongue the same root could mean to write, to cut, or to decree, depending on its shape. The form gave life to the root, not the other way around. A young man began a verse in Hebrew, tripping halfway through. Silence fell. He hesitated, then began again, with new rhythm, same spirit. The elder smiled.
Now it lives again.
Farther down the canyon, an older woman traced symbols in the dust with a reed stalk. Not to record, but to remember the hand's motion. She whispered in Coptic, quiet, vowel-rich, like breath through a tomb's narrow corridor.
Our tongue once filled temples,
she said, not looking up.
It became a priest's tongue, then a monk's, then a martyr's. When we spoke it, we were called dead.
She paused, dragging the reed across a forgotten hieroglyph etched into the stone. Not an image, but a gesture, owl, waterline, folded cloth.
But we did not die,
she said.
We translated ourselves.
And in her mouth, Coptic sounded like both a hymn and a defiance. I realized, not every resurrection needs a body. Some need only a voice. From the mouth of the canyon, another rhythm approached, not chant, but call and response. A man in indigo robes sat on a stone, plucking a 3-stringed lute. He sang in Hausa, the tone-marked melody dancing with nasal vowels and high-low cadences that struck the air like flint on iron. Children circled him, finishing his phrases with laughter or solemn nods. The performance was a grammar unto itself.
This is not just language,
he said between verses.
It is inheritance. My grandfather gave me this song. I added a verse. My son will change the refrain.
When I asked him how he remembered it all, he chuckled.
Memory. No, not memory. Trust. I trust the next voice to carry it forward. Even if it forgets, it will remember the rhythm.
And when he sang again, the canyon seemed to answer. In a narrower pass where the wind blew hard and clean, I heard a woman reciting verse to the open sky. Her Somali rose like waves, alliterative and sharp, built on the spine of consonants. Each line began with the same letter. A chain, a test, a tradition.
Gabe,
she said, when I drew near.
Our poems, our history. We never carved them in stone. We carved them in memory.
She spoke of wars, stopped by stanzas. Feuds cooled by riddles. Truths too dangerous to say in prose, but safe in poetry.
If we forget the poem,
she said,
we forget who we are.
I watched as another woman joined her, continuing the verse mid-line, shifting its meaning with a single word. A duet of survival. Here, silence wasn't absence. It was preparation for the next line. In the Indo-European tower, we had chased permanence, pinned languages like insects to paper, and called that preservation. But here, meaning was breath. Language was fire, not stone. They let me stay. Not as a chronicler, but as a witness. I no longer reached for the pen. I listened. I watched as words were born and reborn, not from silence, but through it. Peleg. Tower 2, the singing grove. Uralic. They told me this forest had no name. But the wind spoke otherwise. I followed the frost-traced birches into the north. Not a direction, they said, an idea. The way their language bends, north is never fixed. It depends on where you stand, whom you're speaking to, and even the shape of the land beneath your feet. Everything here flows outward, like river deltas of meaning, agglutinative, they might have called it in my tower. But this was not my tower, this was the Uralic tongue. Not one language, but a constellation. I heard the rhythmic syllables of Sami yoiks drifting from hilltops. In the valleys, the older women still spoke in long harmonic phrases that layered vowels like snowdrifts. A song for each direction, a word for each kind of silence. Here, a tree is not just a tree. It is the tree near water that remembers wind. Words grow roots, extend branches, echo across generations. Each phrase felt less like speech, and more like memory made audible. They welcomed me with silence, but it was not empty. Their greeting, a deep, resonant hum, seemed to vibrate more in the body than in the air. It reminded me of what I had once dismissed as paralanguage back in the summit. But here, it carried the weight of intention, like grammar rendered in resonance. Not language in the conventional sense, but something older, more elemental. They guided me through the singing grove, where each trunk bore etched lines that arced in soft spirals. Runic inscriptions reminiscent of old Finnic and Permic marks, though no two patterns were alike. Some bore traces of the old syllabaries that once accompanied reindeer migrations across the tundra. Others were entirely new, songs pressed into bark in patterns only the carver could recite. One elder, tall, silent, wrapped in wolfskin, asked me in slow Estonian,
Do you write because you forget, or because you're afraid to?
I had no answer. Only questions. They told stories without speech. Mythologies performed through the body, antler dances, hand signals carved into snow, lullabies hummed through birch flutes. Even their gods, Ukko, Jamala, and others whose names shifted from one tongue to the next, were never fixed in stone. They were weather. They were thresholds. I asked about writing, and they showed me thawing runes, runes deliberately carved into snowbanks, knowing they would vanish by dawn.
Because if it stays,
they said in smooth Finnish,
it hardens.
Later, another voice joined us, older, sharp with distant consonants.
Even Magyar once had its gods in the marshes,
he said,
before it found its cities.
I looked up. And now?
Now it dreams in iron,
he said.
But it remembers the mud.
It was there, among melting symbols, that I remembered. Uralic languages rarely built monuments. They built maps, maps of memory, of migration, of relation. The past wasn't preserved in stone, but sung into the breath of the present. Peleg. Tower 3. The Fire That Speaks Twice. Sino-Tibetan. Mist rose in the early morning as I strolled through the valley, curling around the forested village like a silent tide. The air was thick, damp with the scent of earth and growth. I heard the soft whisper of bamboo stalks as they bent under the weight of the mist, speaking in a language I could not yet understand. I followed the sound of tonal chimes, their high, sweet notes floating through the air, guiding me deeper into the groves. Each chime resonated like the first step into a world I had yet to comprehend, a world where the sound of every word was as crucial as the meaning it carried. I found them in a clearing, the teacher standing tall in front of a small group of children, their faces eager, their eyes sharp. The lesson was in full swing. They spoke, their voices rising and falling like the chimes, each word shaped by the subtle art of tone. The teacher's hands moved, slicing through the air with the precision of a master, guiding them in games of tone and pitch. I stood at the edge, watching the rhythm, feeling the weight of each syllable, each sound that seemed to carry more than it should.
One misstep,
the teacher said, her voice calm and steady.
And you lose not just the word, but the whole world.
She spoke slowly, and the children repeated after her, their voices echoing in the stillness of the grove.
Ma.
A slight quiver in her voice.
Ma,
she said, the pitch rising.
Ma,
she said again, the pitch bouncing for a moment. And finally,
Ma,
the tone falling hard, like a stone. I tried to follow, stepping forward with the courage I had carried from my tower, yet it seemed impossible. The sounds slipped from my tongue as though they were foreign, as though they came from a place I could never reach. Ma. I tried, but the word faltered, not rising as it should. A small boy giggled. The teacher turned, her eyes sharp as the tone she taught.
Your ma is too soft,
she said, repeating the word, with a delicate sharpness that made the air around her hum.
The tone is the shape of the meaning. Without it, the word is nothing.
I tried again. Ma? This time, it felt better, though no less wrong. The children's laughter was gentle, but the frustration in my chest only deepened. I had been a scholar of linguistics in the summit, a master of languages and scripts. Yet here I stood, fumbling with the most fundamental building blocks of another tower beyond my own. The tonal game was like a fire, burning brightly with each mistake, and yet it was that very fire I could not hold. The teacher saw my struggle and nodded.
It is not enough to speak the words. You must feel them. They are alive. They are like fire. You must shape them in your mouth, as a sculptor shapes clay.
The lesson continued, and I remained at the edges, watching but not fully understanding. The words were elusive, the tones like shadows that danced just out of my reach. In the silence between each attempted word, I felt the weight of my failure. Then, the lesson shifted. The teacher led us through the groves to a larger gathering, where a ceremony was underway. It was here that the complexity of language unfolded before me, like a scroll that had never been unrolled. People spoke, but not only with their voices. Their words were written on bamboo, etched delicately with symbols that danced in the air like fireflies, their meanings not just carried in the voice, but in the very shapes they took. And then, there were the projections, images of words, shifting and swirling in the air, like characters of the imagination, as though the language itself was not bound by either time or space, but free to expand and evolve in an instant. The meaning was layered, like a tapestry woven through sound, symbol, and light. I watched, transfixed, as the ceremony continued, the people speaking in unison, their voices rising and falling in harmony with the tones, while the symbols on the bamboo seemed to breathe, moving with the same rhythm as the words. Then the moment came. The teacher turned to me, her eyes unreadable. I was to offer a greeting at the communal feast. The weight of the task settled over me, but I had no choice. I stepped forward, the faces of the gathered villagers watching me with open, kind eyes. I tried to speak, to offer the words the way the teacher had taught me. But the tones, stubborn as stones, refused to align. I butchered the sounds, my voice faltering on each word. I saw the faces of the people shift, their expressions polite. Yet I could feel the edges of my embarrassment sharpen. But then, something remarkable happened. They did not turn away. They did not scold me. Instead, they responded gently, with the same tones I had missed, but with a kindness that softened the sharp edges of my failure. They corrected me, not with judgment, but with grace, guiding my tongue, lifting the tones until they were where they should be. I repeated after them, finally getting it right. The words felt more than just sounds now. They were alive, carried by the breath of those who spoke them, and the warmth of those who listened. As the feast began, I laughed, a sound that felt too foreign on my tongue, yet fitting. Language was not a challenge to be conquered, but a fire to be tended. It required humility, patience, and the willingness to be shaped by the words of others. It was not mastery I sought, but understanding. And in that understanding, I saw something new. Language, in all its complexity, was not something to be controlled. It was something to be shared, like the warmth of a flame that speaks twice, once in the words we say, and again in the way we hear. If only my former colleagues of the summit could see what they have gravely missed in their futile attempts at perfection. And so, as I sat among them, I found myself not the scholar of old, but a learner once more, humbled by the fire of language and the kindness of those who would teach me to speak it. Peleg. Act 2. The Living Archives. Tower 4. The Root Speakers. Austro-Asiatic. The air grew heavy and damp as I descended into the caverns, the walls of stone slick with the weight of centuries. Silence clung to the dark, reverent, almost sacred in its stillness. Here, the earth seemed to breathe through its own pulse, the sound of water dripping, echoing from deep within the belly of the mountain. The silence in these depths was not empty, it was full, alive, a space where every breath was sacred. I had been drawn here by the rhythmic vibrations I felt through the ground beneath my feet. The sound, distant yet distinct, reverberated through the stone like the pulse of the world itself. It was language, but not the kind I had yet known. This was not the quiet, measured rhythm of my tower. This was a tower of raw, earthy liveliness. At the center of a vast chamber, figures moved like shadows in the flickering light of a fire. Their bodies swayed and turned in unison, feet stamping in time with a chant that seemed to shape the very air around them. It was not dance, nor was it speech as I had come to understand it. This was language, but it was a language made of sound, movement, and breath. a language that filled the space between each footfall, between each pulse of the drum. It was spoken through the body, in rhythm, in tone, in the vibrations that reached beyond the surface of the earth and deep into the bones. As I stepped closer, I saw the dancers were shaping the world with each movement. Their voices rose and fell in time with their steps, each sound deepened by the resonance of the earth beneath them. There were no written words, no ink to preserve it. There were no sentences to capture in my notebook. This language was spoken not through the mouth, but through the body, the footfall, the breath, the gesture. A child, no older than 7 or 8, approached me with a quiet smile. She did not speak, but her hand reached out to me in invitation. Her fingers brushed the air with a soft, fluid motion, like the pulse of the chant itself. She guided me gently into the circle. I hesitated. My body felt stiff and awkward against the flow of the dancers, but she did not let me falter. Her hands guided mine, her feet moving in the rhythm, her body swaying with an ease I could not match. Slowly, I found the beat beneath my feet, the rhythm of the chant moving through my limbs. I began to understand. The language here was not simply sound or motion, it was meaning itself, not fixed in form, but relational. The body did not merely perform the words, it was the words. Language here was not spoken alone, it was spoken together. It lived in the space between us, in the connection we shared through movement. It was a conversation without a single word. A language shaped by presence, by touch, by the heartbeat of the earth itself. Later that evening, as the ceremony began, the dancers formed a circle around the fire. The flames flickered and danced, casting long shadows on the stone walls. The rhythm of the drum intensified, each beat now a part of the chant that filled the cavern. I joined the circle, my body now moving with the flow, no longer a stranger to this language. I felt the pulse of it in the ground, in the air, in the fire. The words were not spoken, they were made with each movement, with each breath. As I stood there, joining the others in the rhythm, I realized that the language was not something that could be captured in ink, not something that could be written down. The language here, like the forest itself, was alive, its roots extending far beyond the surface, intertwining with the land, with the people, with the world. It was a language of place, of community, of shared experience. It was a language made of movement and sound, but also of meaning, of connection, of belonging. In the midst of the ceremony, my mind reached back to the notebooks I had carried so far, those pages filled with symbols, those attempts to capture what could never be contained. I stood there, my fingers still tingling with the rhythm, the sensation of it all. I felt the weight of the notebook in my bag, and for the first time, it seemed so inadequate, so empty. I walked to the edge of the firelight, where the earth hummed with the pulse of the dance, and I buried the notebook beneath the stone. Let it rest, I thought. Let it return to the earth, where language lives. For here, language was not something to be captured in symbols or stored in books. It was a living thing, born of the body, of the earth, of the breath we share. It was a thing of the people, made through connection and presence, not through preservation. And as I buried my old attempts to capture it, I felt the world around me expand, not in words, but in understanding. In that moment, I knew that language was not just what we speak, but what we are. It is the rhythm of our hearts, the pulse of the land, the sound of the earth beneath our feet. It is everything, and it is shared. And in this place, I finally understood that language is not a thing to be preserved. It is a thing to be lived. Peleg. Tower V, the archipelago of names. Austronesian. The sea stretched before us, endless and blue, broken only by the chain of islands that lay like scattered pearls upon the water. The boat swayed gently beneath us, carried not by a compass, but by the soft hum of the voices that surrounded me. There were no charts, no instruments of navigation, save for the spoken names of stars, of places, of ancestors. The family that sailed with me had no need for the machines I had once relied upon. They knew the sea as one knows the body, as one knows breath. The scholars in my tower were great seafarers in their own rights, but the sea of the Mediterranean is reduced to a mere puddle compared to the vast Pacific I find myself in. The father sat at the stern, guiding the boat with the knowledge, passed down through generations. His hands gripped the oar with the familiarity of a man who had steered his ancestors home many times over. Beside him, the mother whispered low words into the wind, soft prayers that seemed to slip into the very waves themselves. The children sang, their voices rising in an ancient melody, a song I could not understand, but felt deep in my chest. As we moved from island to island, I learned that every place had its own name, its own story. There was no map, no fixed image of the land. Each island was a whisper in the larger story of their people, a name spoken into the world like a living thing. The family's journey was not one of discovery, but of memory. These were not new lands, but familiar ones, woven into the fabric of their existence. They had lived here for as long as the sea had whispered their names, and every island, every wave, carried the weight of that history. I had not thought to ask questions until I saw it, driftwood, tossed up on the shore, covered in names. These names were not written in any script I knew, but carved deeply into the wood, as if the very earth had demanded to remember them. I could feel their weight as I approached, as though they had been here far longer than the wood itself. Who was this? I asked, my fingers brushing the markings. The father glanced at the driftwood, then at the horizon, his eyes steady but distant.
They are the names of those who sailed before us,
he said in steady Malay.
The names of those who have come and gone, who have lived and loved and disappeared into the sea.
But what do they mean? I pressed. The mother smiled softly, responding in gentle Hawaiian.
Each island will tell you a different answer. Names are like that. They are not fixed. They live in the spaces between us. They change, they grow, they move with the tide.
I tried to trace the names, but no matter how I tried, the answers I sought always eluded me. I asked each island, who was this? But every answer was different, every response shaped by the people who spoke it, by the wind that blew, by the tide that turned. It was not until a storm came, dark and violent, that I understood. The sky darkened as the winds whipped the sea into a frenzy. The boat tossed and shaken in the turmoil. We were blown off course, the familiar islands disappearing behind the clouds like ghosts. The father gripped the oar with a new urgency, but it was the grandmother, sitting at the bow, who took charge. She did not shout, nor did she panic. Instead, she began to chant, her voice steady, her words in ancient Chamorro. She did not speak of stars or waves. She spoke of names. Her chant was like the wind itself, rising and falling with the storm. She named the islands we had passed, and with each name, I felt the storm shift, felt the boat find its course again. She was not naming places in the way I had expected. She was naming memories, stories, the deep current that ran beneath the surface of the world. Her words were like the stars themselves, not fixed, but always in motion, always shifting. The storm subsided, and the sky began to clear. We found our way back to familiar waters, the islands emerging like old friends from the mist. The family was silent now, but their faces were soft, untroubled. They had never feared the storm. They had known the way all along, guided not by maps, but by names that had lived long before they had been born. As we anchored off the shore, I realized something that had eluded me for days. The names were not fixed. They were not tied to a single place, nor a single identity. The names were functions, markers that guided the journey. They lived in the people who spoke them, in the wind that carried them, in the waves that returned them. They were not static, but fluid, always shifting with the tides, always changing with the wind. I sat alone on the deck that night, the stars above me and the sea below, and I felt a pull in my chest. The name I had carried with me from my tower felt foreign here, like a weight I could no longer bear. It had been given to me, but it was not mine, not in the way the names of these islands belonged to the people who sailed them. I rose, walked to the bow, and carved my old name into the wood. For a moment, I hesitated, but then I dropped it into the sea. It was not the name I needed any more. In its place, I carved a new one that belonged to no one but the boat and the sea. It was a name that would live as long as the wind, as long as the stars, as long as the waves whispered it across the islands. A name that did not belong to any tower, but to the world. And I knew, as the boat rocked gently beneath me, that this name would carry me through places where language was not written, but lived, where meaning was not fixed, but always shifting with the tides. This was the way of the islands, the archipelago of names, and here I find a new legacy to carry forward. Kairos. Act 3. The Inheritance. Tower 6. The Flame Beneath the Ashes. Native American. The wind swept across the golden plains, its howl echoing through the old and new alike. The land was scarred, barren stretches dotted with the remains of schools that had once stood proud, but now seemed abandoned to the endless passage of time. Between the ruins, fresh fires burned in small clusters of light, defiant against the cold of the world, carrying with them warmth, stories, and names from the past. I had thought the world silent after my long journey, that the echoes of the Indo-European towers' halls would never be truly silenced in me. But I was wrong. It was in the midst of this vast emptiness that I heard it. Voices, rising not in mourning, but in celebration. I stumbled upon the ceremony as though the land itself had called me here. Leading me to an old church, its roof burned and crumbling, its walls stained with the ash of 1,000 forgotten prayers. Inside, children stood before a flickering fire, chanting in tongues I did not know. But their voices carried the weight of ages, their words ancient, yet woven anew in a tapestry of sound. They spoke in prayers not heard in this place for generations. Old prayers wrapped in new words, altered but not broken, like firelight cast in shifting shadows. As their voices filled the empty space, I stepped closer, drawn by the rhythm, the cadence, the sound of it. And then I saw her, an elder, her face a map of time, her eyes full of memories and struggle, stood at the edge of the circle, watching over the children. She was the keeper, the one who had sewn the threads of their language into the fabric of this place. She saw me, and nodded, as if I had always been meant to arrive at this moment.
You have come to listen,
she said, in Diné, Navajo, as my tongue would know it. Her voice was rough, yet filled with something deeper, something that came from the earth itself.
But these words were never meant to be written. They were meant to live, to breathe.
She spoke of a grandmother, one who had risked everything to preserve the language when it was forbidden, when it was silenced under the weight of laws and policies that sought to erase it. The grandmother had embroidered the language into codes on cloth, hidden in plain sight, and sung lullabies to her children, songs filled with sounds that carried the world's weight. I thought of the oppressed levels I witnessed upon my ascent of my own tower, how language itself became a weapon of control rather than a fire of life and knowledge.
She taught us that language is not bound to paper,
the elder continued.
It lives in the body, in the breath, in the stories we tell, even when no one is listening.
I stood in deep respect. Here, in this ruined church, in the silence of the burned walls, the language had survived, not as an artifact, not as something to be catalogued or preserved, but as a living, breathing part of these people's hearts. As the ceremony continued, I was invited to join. A child, no more than 10, reached out to me and offered me a bundle wrapped in worn leather.
This,
she whispered in Cree,
is the prayer we buried, so that it could rise again.
We dug together, the earth soft beneath our hands. And when we uncovered the bundle, there was no fear, no hesitation. The prayer, long buried beneath the weight of silence and shame, was now held in daylight, ready to speak again. A moment later, another child, his voice high and clear in Iroquoian, began to speak a myth I thought lost forever. A myth that had once lived only in whispers, now spoken aloud. His words, though faltering at first, grew stronger with each breath, until the entire community was listening, their faces aglow with recognition. And then, as he finished, they wept. They wept, not out of sorrow, but from the joy of remembering. The joy of reclaiming that which was thought lost. And as the child's voice rose again, they danced, their feet moving in rhythm with the heartbeat of the earth. I stood in the center of the circle, watching them, hearing their laughter, their sorrow, their joy. They, and all others I have met, have shown me that language is a living thing, born of breath and memory. It belongs to no one, yet to everyone. I had come to this place, seeking to capture it, to hold it, to study it, to preserve it. But as the firelight flickered around me, and the voices of the children sang out in their ancient tongue, I knew that my quest had been misplaced. I simply listened, and I breathed with them. Kairos. Tower VII. The Song of Many Tongues. Niger-Congo. The village was alive with the pulse of voices, a rhythm that seemed born from the earth itself. Faces painted with shifting glyphs passed by me, their expressions constantly changing, as if their very skin carried the language of the land. Here, words were not spoken in isolation. They were woven together, rising and falling in waves of call and response. A song, endless and woven into the fabric of every movement. I had come across languages like this before, a fluid, ever-shifting dance of words. But the moment I stepped into the village, I felt a different flavor. The words did not come from one person alone. They were born in the exchange between them, a conversation that did not belong to any single voice, but to all who contributed. Each phrase was like a ripple in the water, where one drop of sound met the next, and the waves constructed or destructed. The story deepened, and spreading further than I could ever follow. I was invited into the circle, a group of villagers sitting together, their eyes bright with the spark of shared story. Without hesitation, they began. One voice rose and another followed. They did not simply speak, they completed one another's sentences, adding their own layers to the tale. Each voice was another note in a song, shifting the meaning as they went, as if they were composing the story as they spoke. I tried to grasp it. I tried to isolate the words, grasp them, pull them out of the river of sound, but they slipped from my hands like water. No single word could stand alone here. It was the collective rhythm, the shared breath that gave them life. I found myself lost in the flow, the words twisting away from definition, dissolving into something larger than meaning, a shared experience, a communal creation. The deeper I listened, the more I understood. This was not a language to be owned or controlled. It was co-authored. Each phrase was a stepping stone, placed carefully by the one who spoke it, but shaped by everyone who came after. Identity itself flexed with each new phrase, bending to the will of the community, ever-changing, ever-evolving. No one here was speaking for themselves alone. They spoke for each other, for the whole. At the center of the circle, an elder raised her voice, inviting me to join in. Hesitant, I let my own voice rise, unsure if I could find my place in this dynamic conversation. I sang a phrase, softly, unsure of its fit. The moment the sound left my lips, another voice picked it up. It was not a correction. It was a continuation, a new verse. The words I spoke had become part of something larger, something that had already existed before me, and would continue after me. It was then I realized language is not something to be fixed in place. It is a living conversation, a song that belongs to no one, yet to everyone. It cannot be contained in a dictionary or bound by paper. It is made in the spaces between us, in the breaths we share, in the stories we tell together. The story we were creating together would change as the words passed, their meaning never fixed, but always in flux, always growing. I no longer cared about isolating a word or grasping for meaning. The question that had driven me so long, what does this mean, began to fade. It was not the meaning that mattered anymore. It was the journey, the thrill of speaking it, of giving it life and letting it pass on to the next. And now, all I wanted to know was, who will speak it next? And so, I let the rhythm carry me, no longer an outsider, but part of the ebb and flow of the song, joining in the story, becoming one of the voices that would carry it forward. Kairos. Book 3, Epilogue, The End That Speaks. I sat beneath a tree older than any tower, at least I believed it to be so. Its bark was dark with memory, gnarled by time, and its limbs stretched beyond sight, cradling sky and silence alike. No gate barred me now, no scrolls weighed my pack. I had come with nothing but breath. A child stood a little way off, whispering to the wind. I could not hear the words, but I knew their shape. They were not mine to know, nor to record. They belonged to the world that would come after me. In my lap, a scroll lay unmarked, its surface pale and smooth as the clouds above. I did not write upon it. Instead, I pressed into it a single seed, round, silent, alive. It was enough. Then I spoke, not to archive, not to assert, but to freely give. I told the story as I had lived it, the tower's long ascent, the descent beyond its walls, the voices that danced in deserts, on mountains, in dark caves, across vast waters and rolling plains. I spoke of the names that changed shape, the meanings that refused to be captured, the fires that still burned under ash and song. I did not explain. I did not correct. I simply gave the trail back to the air. The child listened. Then, smiling, she retold it. And it changed. I laughed. It was right all the same. I left the scroll beneath the tree, still blank, save for its seed. I rose, joints aching with age, yet light. I did not look back. Language is not a tower. It is a trail of breath across time. And I am no longer its keeper. Only its echo. Kairos. About the author. Gabriel Stroop is a writer with a background in the natural sciences and a lifelong fascination with history. Whether through ancient knowledge or extinct life, most of his stories explore humanity's uneasy relationship with itself and its own past. Though not a polyglot himself, he's captivated by how languages evolve, fracture, and reform, how they carry the weight of culture, conflict, and forgotten knowledge. The Peleg Manuscripts is his attempt to blend poetic structure, mythic framing, and evident history into a meditation on language, power, and the fragility of human understanding. It is, at heart, about the exploration beyond a single tower of knowledge, and what we choose to carry with us. If this story resonated with you, consider leaving an honest review wherever you find it. Reviews matter more than most readers realize, and they help future readers find their own way into the story. Thank you for listening.